When a single father rescues a bleeding woman and her terrified son from a mountain storm, he has no idea he's about to face off against one of America's most powerful families, or that the bruised boy in his arms is worth billions. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far our community reaches. The windshield wipers of Daniel Carter's pickup truck fought a losing battle against the torrential rain that hammered the mountain road like bullets from heaven. Each flash of lightning illuminated the treacherous curves ahead, transforming familiar territory into something alien and menacing. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the worn leather as he navigated the winding path home to his cabin. At 42, Daniel had learned to read storms the way other men read newspapers. This wasn't just weather. This was nature's fury unleashed, the kind of tempest that claimed lives and left families shattered. He should have stayed in town tonight, should have waited it out at Murphy's diner with the other construction workers. But Sophie was home alone, and despite her protests that she was old enough at 16 to handle herself, Daniel couldn't shake the protective instinct that had consumed him since losing his wife 3 years ago. The radio crackled with static and emergency broadcasts. Flash flood warnings remain in effect for all mountain counties. Residents are urged to stay indoors. Daniel reached over to adjust the volume when a pale figure materialized in his headlights like a ghost. Jesus Christ! Daniel slammed on the brakes, his truck fishtailing on the slick asphalt as he fought to avoid the small form standing directly in his path. The vehicle came to a shuddering stop mere feet from what he now realized was a child. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing barefoot in the middle of the road, wearing nothing but soaked pajamas. Daniel threw the truck into park and leaped out into the driving rain, the cold mountain air hitting him like a physical blow. "Kid, what the hell are you doing out here?" The boy didn't move, didn't speak. He simply pointed with a trembling finger toward the steep embankment beside the road. In the intermittent lightning, Daniel could make out what looked like tire tracks gouged into the muddy shoulder, leading down into the darkness beyond. "Is someone down there?" Daniel shouted over the storm. The boy nodded, his lips blue with cold, his dark hair plastered to his skull. There was something in his eyes, a terror so profound it made Daniel's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that look before in the mirror, during those first awful months after Sarah's death. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed a flashlight from his glove compartment and scrambled down the embankment, his boots slipping on the rain-soaked earth. The beam of his light swept across twisted metal and broken glass, a sedan that had clearly lost control and rolled multiple times before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees. "Hello?" Daniel called out, sliding down toward the wreckage. "Is anyone in there?" A weak moan answered him from inside the crumpled vehicle. Daniel's heart hammered as he approached the driver's side, which was now facing skyward. Through the spider-webbed glass, he could see a woman slumped unconsciously over what remained of the steering wheel. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her breathing was shallow but steady. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Daniel tried the door handle, but the frame was too twisted. He'd have to get her out through the windshield. Using a rock, he carefully knocked away the loose glass and reached inside to check her pulse. Strong and regular, thank God. As his fingers touched her wrist, she stirred her eyelids, fluttering open to reveal startling green eyes filled with panic. "Ethan," she whispered the word barely audible above the storm. "Where's Ethan?" "The boy. He's up on the road. He's okay." Daniel kept his voice calm, authoritative, the same tone he used when one of his crew got hurt on a job site. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay very still." Her eyes focused on his face with desperate intensity. "Please," she breathed. "Don't call the police. Please, I'm begging you." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. In his experience, people who didn't want police involvement were usually running from something: drugs, warrants, domestic violence. But looking at this woman's battered face, at the fear in her eyes that went deeper than pain from the accident, he found himself nodding. "Okay," he heard himself say. "No police, but we need to get you to a hospital." "No." The word came out stronger this time. "No hospitals. They'll find us." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his jacket. "Who will find you?" Before she could answer, her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Daniel made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of calling 911, he carefully extracted the woman from the wreckage, noting the bruises on her arms that clearly hadn't come from the car accident. Someone had hurt her, and recently. The trek back up the embankment while carrying an unconscious woman nearly broke him. By the time he reached his truck, Daniel's lungs burned and his legs shook with exhaustion. The boy. Ethan stood exactly where he'd left him, unnaturally still in the driving rain. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan asked, as Daniel gently laid the woman across the back seat of his truck. "She's going to be fine," Daniel promised, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Come on, get in the cab. You're freezing." As they drove toward his cabin, Daniel stole glances at the boy in his rearview mirror. Ethan sat perfectly still, his small hands folded in his lap, staring out at the storm with an expression far too mature for his age. There was something almost military in his posture, as if he'd been trained to endure discomfort without complaint. "What's your mom's name?" Daniel asked gently. "Claire," Ethan replied without looking away from the window. "Claire Marchand." The surname meant nothing to Daniel, but the way the boy said it, with a mixture of pride and fear, suggested it should. "And your dad?" Ethan's reflection in the window went very still. "He's dead." The simple statement, delivered without emotion, made Daniel's hands tighten on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry, son. When did that happen?" 3 weeks ago." Still no emotion, as if Ethan was reciting something he'd memorized. "He was murdered." Daniel nearly drove off the road. "Murdered. They said it was an accident, a gas leak in his office building." But Mom knew better. For the first time, Ethan turned to look at Daniel directly. "That's why we ran." The cabin appeared through the trees like a lighthouse in the storm, its warm windows glowing against the darkness. Daniel had built this place with his own hands after Sarah died, needing something to do with his grief, somewhere to start over with Sophie. Now, as he carried an unconscious woman through his front door, with her traumatized son trailing behind, he wondered if he was inviting chaos into the sanctuary he'd worked so hard to create. "Dad!" Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, her blonde hair tousled from sleep. At 16, she had her mother's delicate features, but Daniel's stubborn chin. "What's going on?" "I found them on the road. Car accident." Daniel laid Claire carefully on the living room couch, grateful for the large first aid kit he kept stocked from his construction work. "Sophie, can you get some clean towels and warm blankets?" Sophie took one look at Claire's battered face and Ethan's haunted eyes and sprang into action without question. She'd inherited her mother's nurturing instincts along with her beauty. As Daniel cleaned Claire's wounds, he found evidence of systematic abuse: fingerprint bruises on her upper arms, partially healed cuts on her wrists, a fading black eye hidden beneath makeup. Whoever had done this to her was methodical, careful to avoid marks that would show in normal circumstances. "Sir?" Ethan appeared at his elbow, having shed his soaked pajamas for one of Sophie's oversized sweatshirts. "You should know something about my family." Daniel paused in his ministrations. What's that, son? My grandfather is Edward Marchand. He owns banks and newspapers and politicians. Ethan's voice was matter-of-fact, but his small hands trembled. He doesn't like losing things that belong to him. The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Edward Marchand, even a small-town construction worker, knew that name. One of the wealthiest men in America with interests spanning from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. If this boy was telling the truth, Ethan, why did you and your mom run from your grandfather? The boy was quiet for so long, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because my Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia killed my dad to get his money. And when Mom found out, they tried to kill us too. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Daniel found himself looking at this small, broken child and seeing not just a victim, but a target worth billions of dollars. And he'd just brought that target into his home where his daughter slept upstairs. Claire stirred on the couch, her eyes fluttering open to focus on Daniel's face. For a moment, confusion clouded her features. Then memory returned, and with it terror. Ethan! She tried to sit up, wincing, as the movement sent pain shooting through her ribs. I'm here, Mom! Ethan took her hand, and Daniel watched the woman's face transform as she realized her son was safe. Where are we? Claire's eyes swept the rustic interior of the cabin, the stone fireplace, the handmade furniture, the family photos on the mantel. My home, Daniel said simply. You're safe here. Claire studied his face intently, as if trying to read his intentions in the lines around his eyes. You don't know who I am, do you? Your son told me. Claire Marchand. And something about your husband's family trying to hurt you. A bitter laugh escaped Claire's lips. Hurt us. They're trying to erase us. Richard thinks if Ethan and I disappear, he can claim Michael's inheritance. $23 billion, Mr. Carter. Daniel Carter. And this is my daughter, Sophie. Sophie had returned with blankets, and now stood frozen in the doorway, her arms full of clean linens, her young face a mask of shock. Daniel realized she'd heard enough to understand they weren't dealing with ordinary fugitives. 23 billion, Sophie whispered. That's just the trust fund, Ethan said matter-of-factly. There's more, lots more. Daniel sank into his armchair, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He was a simple man with simple problems, mortgage payments, Sophie's college fund, keeping his construction crew employed during the slow winter months. He wasn't equipped to handle this level of wealth and danger. You should call the police, Claire said, though her voice lacked conviction. Turn us in. It's safer for you. Mom, no. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. He won't do that. Will you, Mr. Carter? Daniel looked at this brave little boy who'd stood in the middle of a mountain road in a thunderstorm to save his mother's life. He thought about the bruises on Claire's body, about a family willing to commit murder for money. And he thought about Vafsh, who was watching him with eyes that said she already knew what his answer would be shown. No, Daniel said quietly. I won't call anyone. Relief flooded Claire's features, followed immediately by guilt. You don't understand what you're agreeing to. The Marchands don't just have money, they have connections everywhere. Judges, politicians, law enforcement. Richard probably already has people looking for us. Then we'll have to be smart about this. Daniel was surprised to hear the determination in his own voice. First thing is getting you properly looked at. You might have internal injuries from the accident. I can't go to a hospital. They'll find us. I know someone who can help. Doc Henley, he's retired, lives about 10 miles down the mountain. Used to be an army medic, then ran the clinic in town for 30 years. He's good people and he knows how to keep his mouth shut. Sophie finally moved from the doorway, setting the blankets on a nearby chair. I'll make some tea. And soup. You both look like you haven't eaten in days. As Sophie bustled toward the kitchen, Daniel caught Claire watching his daughter with an expression of wonder. She's beautiful, Claire said softly. How old? 16. Lost her mom 3 years ago. Daniel felt the familiar ache in his chest. She's had to grow up fast. I'm sorry. Claire's voice carried genuine sympathy. It's hard losing a parent. What about Ethan's father? You said he was murdered. Claire's face hardened. Michael was a good man, too good for his family. He never wanted any part of the business. He taught high school history. Can you believe that? A marchand choosing to be a teacher instead of a corporate raider. She paused, her fingers absently stroking Ethan's hair as he leaned against the couch. Michael's grandfather, Edward's father, left everything to be divided equally among his grandchildren when they came of age. But there was a clause: if any heir died before 35, their share would go to their children, with the surviving spouse as guardian, until the child reached majority. And Michael died before 35, Daniel guessed. 3 weeks before his birthday. Claire's voice was hollow. 3 weeks before Ethan would have inherited directly. Now it all goes into trust with me as guardian, and Richard as backup guardian, if anything happens to me. The implication hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. So, if you die, Richard controls everything until Ethan turns 21. And given the Marchand family history with accidents, Ethan probably wouldn't make it that long. Ethan spoke up suddenly, his young voice carrying an eerie calm. Uncle Richard told me at Dad's funeral that accidents happen all the time. He said I should be very careful. Daniel felt rage building in his chest, white-hot fury at anyone who would threaten a child. What kind of family does that to their own blood? The kind that values money over everything else, Claire replied bitterly. Edward raised his sons to see people as assets or liabilities, nothing more. Sophie returned with steaming mugs of tea and set them on the coffee table. I put honey in yours, she told Ethan. My mom always said honey helps everything heal faster. Ethan accepted the mug with both hands, inhaling the sweet steam. Thank you. Your mom sounds nice. She was. Sophie's smile was gentle. She would have liked you. As the group settled into an uneasy quiet broken only by the storm continuing to rage outside, Daniel found himself studying Claire Marchand. Despite her injuries and obvious exhaustion, there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of someone who'd fought long and hard to protect what mattered most. Her love for Ethan was evident in every glance, every protective gesture. Can I ask you something? Daniel said finally. Claire nodded. Why didn't you go to the FBI if you have evidence that your husband was murdered? Claire's laugh was bitter. Evidence? You mean like the fact that Michael called me the morning he died, saying he'd found something in Richard's office that would change everything, or that the gas leak happened in a building? Richard's company had just finished renovating, or that the security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that day? She shook her head. It's all circumstantial, and even if it wasn't. Do you know how many federal judges owe their careers to Edward Marchand? How many politicians have taken his money over the years? Daniel was beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. So you ran. I took Ethan, and we drove as far as we could get on cash. Been moving every few days, staying in cheap motels, trying to figure out our next move. Claire's voice cracked slightly. Tonight, we were driving through the mountains, trying to reach a friend in Colorado who might help us. The storm came out of nowhere, and I lost control on one of those curves. Mom was really scared, Ethan added quietly. She kept checking the mirrors saying someone was following us. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Following you. I thought I saw the same headlights for the last 50 miles, Claire admitted. But in this storm it was hard to tell. Could have been anyone. Daniel walked to the front window and peered out into the darkness. The storm was beginning to ease, but the rain still fell steadily, and the mountain road remained empty as far as he could see. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. We should get some rest, he said finally. Morning's time enough to figure out what comes next. Mr. Carter, Claire began. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Daniel's voice was firm. And it's Daniel. Sophie, can you set up the guest room for Claire? Ethan can take the couch down here. I don't mind sharing with Mom, Ethan said quickly. The guest room has twin beds, Sophie assured him. You'll both fit just fine. As they prepared for what remained of the night, Daniel found himself watching the interplay between his daughter and their unexpected guests. Sophie seemed drawn to Ethan's quiet maturity, while the boy appeared fascinated by her easy confidence. Claire, meanwhile, moved through their home with careful appreciation, touching nothing without permission, but clearly grateful for every small kindness. Daniel, Claire said, as he prepared to bank the fire for the night. Why are you doing this? You don't know us. For all you know, we could be lying about everything. Daniel considered the question seriously. Could be. But I've got good instincts about people comes from running a construction crew for 20 years. And my instincts say you're telling the truth. He paused, studying her face in the firelight. Besides, I know what it's like to lose someone you love. If there's even a chance that boy's father was murdered and you're running for your lives. Daniel shrugged. Well, I guess I'd rather be wrong about helping good people than right about turning away folks who needed it. Claire's eyes filled with tears, the first sign of vulnerability she'd shown since the accident. Thank you. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. Get some sleep, Daniel said gently. Tomorrow we'll call Doc Henley, get you checked out properly. Then we'll figure out how to keep you both safe. As the house settled into quiet, Daniel made one final check of the doors and windows before heading upstairs. The storm was moving on, leaving behind the clean scent of washed earth and pine. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what he suspected would be a very different world than the one he'd woken up to that morning. In the guest room, he could hear Sophie's soft voice explaining the house rules to Ethan, how the shower worked, where to find extra blankets, which floorboards creaked if you stepped on them wrong. Claire's murmured thanks drifted through the thin walls. Daniel paused outside Sophie's room, listening to his daughter's easy acceptance of their situation. She'd lost her mother at 13, but instead of making her bitter or fearful, the experience had somehow deepened her capacity for compassion. Sarah would be proud of the young woman their daughter was becoming. As he finally settled into his own bed, Daniel found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. Every sound outside made him tense: the wind in the trees, the settling of the house, the distant cry of a night bird. He'd meant what he told Claire about his instincts, but those same instincts were now screaming that their troubles were far from over. Somewhere out there in the darkness, powerful people were looking for a woman and her son. People with unlimited resources and flexible morals. People who saw murder as a business transaction. Daniel had faced down angry union bosses, survived construction accidents that should have killed him, and rebuilt his life from scratch after losing his wife. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to his daughter sleep safely down the hall, and the soft breathing of the refugees he'd taken into his home, he wondered if he'd finally bitten off more than he could chew. Outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless human dramas played out on the earth below. In a few hours, the mountain would wake to sunshine and the promise of a new day. But Daniel suspected that by sunset, their lives would be forever changed. The boy sleeping on the guest room bed was worth more money than Daniel could comprehend. His mother carried secrets that could topple financial empires. And somewhere in the network of wealth and power that ruled from distant boardrooms, men were making plans that would inevitably lead them to this small cabin hidden in the mountains. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to find the peace that usually came with having done the right thing. But tonight, the right thing felt like standing in the path of an avalanche with nothing but determination and stubborn mountain pride to stop it. The last thing he remembered before finally drifting off was Sarah's voice, as clear as if she were lying beside him. Sometimes, Danny, doing what's right is the only choice that lets you live with yourself. In the morning, he'd have to figure out how to protect two people who'd stumbled into his life carrying more danger than he'd ever imagined. But for now, they were safe, warm, and sheltered from the storm. It would have to be enough. Dawn broke over the mountains like a gentle benediction, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. Daniel woke to the sound of quiet voices drifting from the kitchen below, a sound so foreign to his usual solitary mornings that for a moment he wondered if he'd dreamed the events of the night before. The aroma of coffee and bacon confirmed that Claire and Ethan were very real and very much still in his home. Daniel dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, pausing at the bottom step to take in the scene before him. Sophie stood at the stove, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, expertly flipping pancakes while chattering about her favorite hiking trails. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his small hands wrapped around a glass of orange juice, listening with the intense focus of someone who'd been starved for normal conversation. Claire moved carefully around the kitchen, still favoring her left side from the accident, but insisting on helping despite Sophie's protests. "Morning," Daniel announced his presence, and three heads turned toward him with varying degrees of relief. "Dad, perfect timing," Sophie beamed at him. "I was just telling Ethan about the old mining trail up to Eagle's Peak. I thought maybe later we could—" "Sophie." Daniel's gentle warning stopped her mid-sentence. They couldn't afford to think in terms of later until they knew how much danger they were really in. Claire caught the exchange and her face tightened with guilt. "We should go. We've imposed enough, and staying here puts you both at risk. You're not going anywhere until Doc Henley has a look at you," Daniel said firmly, accepting the cup of coffee Sophie pressed into his hands. "I called him an hour ago. He'll be here after lunch." "You called someone?" The fear in Claire's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Relax. Doc's been delivering babies and patching up mountain folk for 40 years. He knows how to mind his own business." Daniel settled at the table across from Ethan, noting how the boy automatically positioned himself between his mother and any potential threat. "Besides, you need proper medical attention. That head injury could be serious." Ethan looked up from his juice, his dark eyes grave beyond his years. "Are you sure we can trust him?" The question, asked with such adult caution by someone who should have been worried about homework and video games instead of betrayal and murder, made Daniel's chest ache. "Son, in these mountains, a man's word is his bond. Doc Henley gave me his word." Sophie set a plate of pancakes in front of Ethan, her movements gentle and nurturing. "My dad's right. Doc Henley delivered half the babies in the county, including me. He's good people." "Thank you," Ethan said politely, but Daniel noticed he didn't touch the food until his mother nodded her approval. Such caution in a child spoke of hard lessons learned too young. As they ate breakfast, Daniel found himself studying Claire in the morning light. The harsh fluorescent kitchen lighting revealed details. The firelight had hidden exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, a wariness that spoke of weeks spent looking over her shoulder, but also an underlying strength that suggested she was far from broken. "Tell me about your husband," Daniel said suddenly, then immediately regretted the directness when Claire flinched. But after a moment, she began to speak, her voice soft with memory. Michael was different from the rest of his family. While his brothers were learning to manipulate stock prices, Michael was reading history books. While they were networking at country clubs, he was volunteering at literacy programs. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she continued. His father, Edward's son James, died when Michael was 12. A hunting accident, they said, though Michael always wondered. After that, Edward tried to mold Michael into the perfect marchand heir, but Michael resisted every step of the way. "How did you meet him?" Sophie asked, clearly fascinated by this glimpse into a world so different from their own. A smile ghosted across Claire's features, the first genuine happiness Daniel had seen from her. "I was teaching 4th grade at the elementary school where he volunteered. He came in every Thursday to read to my class, always brought these amazing historical biographies written for kids. The children adored him." "What did he teach?" Ethan spoke up, and Daniel realized the boy was hungry for any stories about his father. "American history mostly, but he made it come alive. He'd dress up as historical figures, create these elaborate role-playing exercises." Claire's voice grew stronger as she talked about Michael. "He used to say that understanding the past was the only way to avoid repeating its mistakes." "Sounds like a good man," Daniel said quietly. "He was, which is why his family hated him." The hardness returned to Claire's voice. To them, Michael's teaching career was an embarrassment. They tolerated it because they assumed he'd eventually come to his senses and join the family business. When he married me, a public school teacher from a middle-class family, they barely spoke to us. Daniel could hear the pain beneath her words, the isolation of being ostracized by people who should have been family. But they stayed in contact, barely. Holiday cards, the occasional family gathering, where we were seated at the children's table, despite being adults with our own child. Claire's jaw tightened. Everything changed when Michael's grandfather died last year, and the will was read. $23 billion, Sophie breathed, and Daniel shot her a warning look. "The money was never supposed to matter," Claire continued. "Michael's trust fund was set up so he'd never have to work, but he chose to anyway. He donated most of his inheritance to educational charities, said money that wasn't earned was money that corrupted." "But then he died," Ethan said matter-of-factly. "And suddenly Uncle Richard cared a lot about our family." The boy's clinical assessment of his own tragedy made Daniel's heart break a little more. "What happened, exactly?" "The day your father died." Claire was quiet for so long Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Michael had been acting strange for weeks. Distracted, worried about something he wouldn't discuss. That morning he got a call that made him go very pale. He said he had to go to Richard's office building, that there was something he needed to check. She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "He called me around noon, excited about something. Said he'd found documents that proved Richard had been embezzling from the family trusts for years. He was going to copy everything and take it to the FBI. But he never made it out," Daniel guessed. "The explosion happened an hour later. They said a gas line had been damaged during recent renovations, that it was a tragic accident." Claire's voice cracked. "But Michael was smart, careful. He would never have gone into a building if he'd smelled gas." "And the documents he found?" Daniel asked. "Gone, along with half the top floor of the building." Claire's laugh was bitter. Amazing how the explosion was contained to exactly the offices that would have held evidence of Richard's crimes. Sophie had gone very still, her young face pale with the realization of what they were discussing. So they really did murder him. I know they did. But knowing and proving are two different things. Claire stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the mountain forest. 3 days after the funeral, Richard came to our house with papers for me to sign. Said it was just administrative stuff related to Michael's estate. But it wasn't, Ethan said. It was a power of attorney giving Richard control over Ethan's inheritance in case anything happened to me. When I refused to sign, Richard got very angry, said accidents seemed to run in the family, and I should think carefully about Ethan's future. Daniel felt that familiar rage building in his chest. He threatened you, in your own home. Not directly. Richard's too smart for that, but the message was clear. Claire turned back to face them, her green eyes blazing with determination. That night, I packed what we could carry, and we ran. Where were you trying to go? Sophie asked. A friend from college lives in Colorado. Sarah Chen, she's a federal prosecutor now. I thought if we could reach her, she might know how to protect us. Claire's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. But they found us at every hotel, every rest stop. It's like they have eyes everywhere. They probably do, Daniel said grimly. People with that kind of money can buy a lot of cooperation. The sound of a vehicle approaching made them all freeze. Daniel moved quickly to the front window, peering through the curtains at the gravel drive. A familiar blue sedan was making its way up the winding path to the cabin. It's Doc Henley, Daniel announced, and the tension in the room eased slightly. Claire, you ready for this? She nodded, though Daniel could see the effort it cost her to trust yet another stranger. What did you tell him? That I found an injured woman and her son after a car accident, and they needed medical attention without a lot of questions asked. Daniel opened the front door as the elderly doctor approached. Doc's seen enough domestic violence cases to know when not to pry. Dr. Malcolm Henley looked every one of his 74 years, but his movements were still sure, and his blue eyes sharp with intelligence. He'd been treating the mountain community since before Daniel was born, and his discretion was legendary. Danny boy, Doc greeted him with a firm handshake. Been a while since you called for a house visit. Appreciate you coming, Doc. This is Claire Marchand and her son Ethan. If Doc recognized the Marchand name, he gave no sign. He simply nodded politely and set his medical bag on the coffee table. Well then, let's have a look at you, young lady. From what Danny tells me, you took quite a tumble last night. As Doc examined Claire, asking gentle questions about her symptoms and injuries, Daniel found himself watching Ethan watch the doctor. The boy's attention was laser-focused, as if he was memorizing every detail in case he needed to testify later. It was another reminder that this child had been forced to grow up far too fast. You've got a mild concussion, Doc announced after completing his examination. Couple of bruised ribs, some nasty cuts and bruises, but nothing that won't heal with time and rest. How much time? Claire asked. Week or two for the worst of it. Concussion symptoms can linger longer: headaches, dizziness, sensitivity to light. You'll need to take it easy. Doc's expression was kind but firm. And I mean really take it easy. No driving, no stress, plenty of rest. Daniel saw Claire's face fall. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for 2 weeks, not with Richard Marchand's people looking for them. Doc, Daniel said carefully, what would happen if someone with these injuries had to travel, hypothetically speaking? The old physician's eyes sharpened, and Daniel could practically see him putting pieces together. Hypothetically, I'd say that would be a very bad idea. Could turn a minor head injury into something much more serious. What if they didn't have a choice? Doc Henley was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel's face. Then he turned to Claire. Young lady, I've been practicing medicine in these mountains for more years than you've been alive. I've seen what desperation looks like, and I've learned when not to ask questions that might put good people in danger. Claire's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. Thank you. That said, Doc continued, you're in no shape to be running anywhere right now. Best thing you can do is rest, heal, and let your friends help you figure out a better plan. As Doc packed up his medical supplies, he pulled Daniel aside. Don't know what kind of trouble that young woman's in, but it's the dangerous kind. Those bruises on her arms didn't come from any car accident. I know, Daniel said quietly. She's lucky she found you. Not many folks would take in strangers these days, especially not ones carrying that kind of fear. Doc's blue eyes were grave. You be careful, Danny. Sometimes doing the right thing comes with a heavy price. After Doc left, promising to check on Claire in a few days, the group settled into an uneasy routine. Sophie appointed herself Ethan's guide to mountain life, showing him how to identify different bird calls and teaching him card games that had been passed down through generations of mountain families. The boy absorbed everything with an intensity that suggested he was storing up normal moments against an uncertain future. Claire spent most of the day resting on the couch, but Daniel caught her watching the interactions between Sophie and Ethan with something approaching wonder. It was as if she was seeing her son be a child for the first time in weeks. Sophie's wonderful with him, Claire said during one of these quiet observations. She's got her mother's heart, Daniel replied, settling into his chair with a cup of coffee. Always been drawn to anything that needs protecting, like wounded birds and stray cats, and apparently fugitive mothers and their billionaire sons. Daniel's attempt at humor fell flat, and Claire winced at the reminder of their situation. I keep thinking we should leave, she said softly. Every hour we stay here is another hour we're putting your family in danger. And every hour you're on the road is another chance for them to find you. Daniel's voice was firm. Doc's right, you need time to heal, and maybe we can use that time to figure out a better plan than just running until you drop. Claire was quiet for a moment, watching Ethan laugh at something Sophie had said. It was the first genuine laughter Daniel had heard from the boy since they'd arrived. I've been running for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stop, Claire admitted, to feel safe even if it's just for a moment. You are safe, Daniel said. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, you're both safe here. The afternoon passed peacefully, with Sophie and Ethan exploring the area around the cabin, while Claire dozed on the couch. Daniel used the time to plan to consider options that might give this small family a real chance at survival. As evening approached and Sophie began preparing dinner, Daniel made a decision. Claire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. She looked up from the book Sophie had given her, immediately alert. What is it? These documents your husband found the evidence of Richard's embezzling. Is there any chance copies still exist somewhere? Claire's face went very still. Why do you ask? Because if we can prove Richard's been stealing from the family trusts, it changes everything. Instead of you and Ethan being inconvenient obstacles to his inheritance, Richard becomes the criminal. The focus shifts to him. Michael said he was going to copy everything, Claire said slowly, but he never got the chance. What about backups, email accounts, cloud storage, anything like that? Claire shook her head. Michael was old-fashioned about technology. Didn't trust digital storage for important documents. Said too many people could hack into it. Daniel felt a flicker of disappointment, but something in Claire's expression suggested there was more to the story. "But," he prompted. Claire glanced toward the kitchen where Sophie and Ethan were arguing good-naturedly about seasoning for the chicken. Michael had a safety deposit box, Bank of the Rockies downtown branch. He kept important papers there, birth certificates, insurance policies, things like that. Would he have put copies of the documents there? Maybe, if he had time. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. But I don't have access to it. Michael never added me to the signature card. What about Ethan? He's the backup heir, but he's too young to access it without a guardian's permission. Claire's laugh was bitter. And guess who's listed as backup guardian if something happens to me? Richard, Daniel said grimly. Exactly. It's the perfect trap. If I try to access Michael's safety deposit box, I have to go through legal channels that will alert Richard to our location. If I don't, any evidence sitting in that box stays hidden forever. Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. They needed that evidence, but retrieving it would be like sending up a flare to announce their location. What if we could get it without going through official channels? He asked. You mean illegally? Claire's eyes widened. Daniel, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Daniel's voice was steady, determined. Sometimes the law isn't enough to protect good people from bad ones. Sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands. Before Claire could respond, Sophie's voice called from the kitchen. Dad, Ethan wants to know if you can teach him how to use the chainsaw. Absolutely not. Both Daniel and Claire called out simultaneously, then looked at each other and laughed. It was the first moment of genuine lightness since their ordeal began. I'll stick to teaching him how to chop firewood with an axe, Daniel said, standing to join the kids in the kitchen. Much safer. As they gathered around the dinner table, Daniel found himself marveling at how quickly this broken little family had begun to heal in the warmth of basic human kindness. Sophie chattered about her plans to show Ethan the old copper mine tomorrow, while Ethan described the differences between mountain wildlife and the suburban animals he was used to seeing. Claire watched the interaction with eyes that held both gratitude and sorrow. Grateful for the normalcy her son was experiencing, but sad that it couldn't last. You know what? Sophie announced suddenly. I think we should have a movie night. Dad, do we still have that collection of old westerns in the den? Probably covered in dust, but yeah. Daniel smiled at his daughter's determination to create positive memories for their guests. Perfect, Ethan. You're going to love The Magnificent Seven. It's all about regular people standing up to bullies who think money makes them untouchable. The irony of the movie choice wasn't lost on any of the adults, but they settled into the living room anyway, Sophie and Ethan claiming the floor with a pile of pillows while Daniel and Claire took the couch. As the opening credits rolled, Daniel was acutely aware of Claire's presence beside him. The warmth of her body, the subtle scent of her shampoo, the way she unconsciously leaned closer during the more suspenseful scenes. It had been 3 years since he'd shared quiet moments like this with a woman, 3 years since he'd felt that spark of connection that reminded him he was more than just Sophie's father or the crew boss at Carter Construction. The realization was as unsettling as it was welcome. Halfway through the movie, Ethan fell asleep against Sophie's shoulder, exhausted by the day's activities and the first real relaxation he'd experienced in weeks. Sophie carefully adjusted her position to make him more comfortable, and Daniel felt his heart swell with pride at his daughter's instinctive compassion. She's going to make an amazing mother someday, Claire whispered. Don't say that too loud, Daniel replied. She's already making noises about skipping college to see the world. Last thing I need is her getting ideas about settling down young. Claire smiled. Smart and adventurous. I like that combination. They finished the movie in comfortable quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and Ethan's peaceful breathing. When the credits rolled, Daniel carefully lifted the sleeping boy and carried him to the guest room while Sophie gathered up the pillows and blankets. "Thank you," Claire said, as Daniel tucked Ethan under the covers. "For everything. For saving us, for bringing us here, for treating us like family instead of burdens." "You're not burdens," Daniel said firmly. "And this is what family does. They take care of each other." Claire looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Is that what we are, the family?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address. Daniel found himself studying her face in the dim light from the hallway. The curve of her cheek, the vulnerability in her green eyes, the strength that radiated from her even in her moments of doubt. "I don't know what we are," he said honestly. "But I know I'm not letting anything happen to you or Ethan, whatever that makes us." Claire stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. "Daniel, Mom." Ethan's sleepy voice interrupted whatever she'd been about to say. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." Claire moved to the bed, smoothing Ethan's hair with gentle fingers. "Sweet dreams." Daniel retreated to the hallway, giving mother and son their moment while fighting the urge to return to Claire's side. The attraction between them was undeniable, but the timing was impossible. She was running for her life, traumatized and vulnerable. He was risking everything to protect her. Starting something romantic now would be taking advantage of the situation, no matter how much he wanted to comfort her. But as he lay in bed later that night, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of Claire's face in the firelight, or the way she'd looked at him when she'd called him family. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was allowing himself to imagine a future that included someone else. It was a dangerous thought given their circumstances, but one he couldn't quite dismiss. Outside his window, an owl house called to its mate across the dark forest, and Daniel found himself hoping that someday, when all this was over, Claire and Ethan might choose to stay in these mountains. That the family they'd begun to build out of necessity might become something real and lasting. It was a foolish hope, perhaps, but as Daniel finally drifted off to sleep, it was the thought that brought him peace. The morning of the third day dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the mountainside in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Daniel woke to the sound of laughter drifting through his bedroom window. Real, unguarded laughter that made his heart lift even as it reminded him how rare such moments had become in his home since Sarah's death. He found Sophie and Ethan in the backyard attempting to build what appeared to be a fort out of fallen branches and old tarps. Ethan's face was flushed with excitement and exertion, more animated than Daniel had seen him since that first terrifying night. Sophie was patiently showing him how to lash the branches together, her natural teaching instincts on full display. "Morning, architects!" Daniel called out, stepping onto the back porch with his coffee. "What's the building code situation on that structure?" "It's not a building. It's a reconnaissance post," Ethan explained with the serious tone of someone who'd clearly thought this through. "Sophie says every good fort needs a place to watch for trouble coming up the mountain." The casual mention of watching for trouble hit Daniel like cold water, a reminder that even in play, this child couldn't escape the reality of their situation. He caught Sophie's eye over Ethan's head and saw his own concern reflected there. "Smart thinking," Daniel said, keeping his voice light. "Your dad would be proud of you for being so careful." Ethan's face lit up at the mention of his father. "Mom says Dad was really good at planning things. He used to make these elaborate treasure hunts for me with maps and clues and everything." "Sounds like he was a special man," Daniel said, meaning every word. He was. Claire's voice came from behind him, and Daniel turned to see her standing in the doorway, looking more rested than she had since arriving. The swelling around her eye had gone down considerably, and though she still moved carefully, there was more strength in her bearing. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked. "Better. Much better, actually." Claire stepped onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. "I haven't slept that well in weeks." There was something in her tone that made Daniel look at her more closely. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her green eyes held a clarity that had been missing before. But more than that, there was a sense of determination about her that hadn't been there the night before. "Good. Doc said rest was the best medicine." Daniel studied her face, noting the way she was watching Ethan play, with an expression that mixed maternal love with something harder to define. "What's on your mind, Claire?" She was quiet for a moment, then spoke without taking her eyes off her son. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the safety deposit box." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. And I think you're right. Running isn't working. Every day we stay on the road is another day Richard gets stronger, covers his tracks better. If there's evidence in that box, evidence that could prove Michael was murdered, then we have to get it. The resolve in her voice was unmistakable, but Daniel could also hear the fear underneath it. "It's dangerous, Claire. The moment you show up at that bank, I know. Which is why I'm not going to show up at the bank." Claire turned to face him fully, and Daniel saw steel in her green eyes. "You are." "What?" Daniel nearly dropped his coffee mug. "Claire, I can't just walk into a bank and demand access to someone else's safety deposit box. Not as yourself, no, but maybe as Michael's business partner, his attorney. There has to be a way." Claire's voice grew more urgent. "Daniel, if we don't do something soon, Richard is going to find us. And when he does—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They all knew what Richard Marchand was capable of. "Even if I could get into the box, I wouldn't know what to look for," Daniel pointed out. "I would. I could describe everything: file names, document types, anything that might prove Richard's been embezzling." Claire's hands clenched into fists. "I lived with Michael for 8 years. I know how he organized important papers." Daniel found himself considering the plan, despite its obvious flaws. The Bank of the Rockies was 40 miles down the mountain, in the small city of Cedar Falls. A place where a construction worker might plausibly have business, where he might not be immediately recognized as an outsider. "It's crazy," he said finally. "Crazy enough to work?" Claire asked hopefully. Before Daniel could answer, the sound of vehicles approaching made them both freeze. Not one car this time, but several, the low rumble of powerful engines making their way up the winding mountain road. "Sophie," Daniel called sharply. "Get Ethan inside. Now." His daughter looked up from the fort, immediately reading the alarm in his voice. Without question, she grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him toward the cabin. Claire was already moving her maternal instincts, overriding everything else as she rushed to get between her son and whatever was coming. Daniel stepped off the porch and walked toward the front of the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the trees, he could see flashes of black metal, expensive vehicles that had no business on these mountain roads. As they drew closer, he counted 3 black SUVs moving in formation, their tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside. "Daniel!" Claire's voice was tight with terror as she joined him. Ethan pressed close to her side. "It's them. It has to be them." The lead SUV pulled into Daniel's gravel driveway, followed by the other 2. For a moment, no one moved. The vehicles sat there like sleeping predators, their engines ticking as they cooled the silence, somehow more menacing than any threat could have been. Then the doors opened. The first man out was clearly the leader, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Daniel made in 6 months. Even from a distance, the family resemblance to Ethan was unmistakable. This had to be Edward Marchand himself. Behind him came 4 other men in expensive suits, moving with the controlled precision of professional security. And from the second vehicle emerged a younger man who made Claire gasp in recognition, tall, dark-haired, with cold eyes that swept the cabin and its surroundings like he was cataloging every detail. "Richard," Claire whispered, and Daniel felt her trembling beside him. The man who had murdered her husband was standing in Daniel's driveway, close enough to touch. The group approached the cabin slowly, their formation clearly practiced. Edward Marchand walked in the center, flanked by his security team, with Richard slightly behind and to the left. Everything about their approach was designed to intimidate, to remind anyone watching that they were dealing with people who had unlimited resources and flexible morals. "Mr. Carter, I presume?" Edward's voice carried the cultured tones of old money and elite education, but underneath it, Daniel could hear steel. "I'm Edward Marchand. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Daniel stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the Marchands and the cabin where Sophie and Ethan were hidden. "Mr. Marchand, can't say I was expecting visitors this morning." "I'm sure you weren't." Edward's smile was cold as winter. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to be very direct with you. You're harboring my daughter-in-law and grandson who disappeared 3 weeks ago after suffering what appears to have been a mental breakdown following my son's tragic death." The smooth lie rolled off Edward's tongue with practiced ease, and Daniel found himself marveling at how reasonable the man could make kidnapping and murder sound. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed," Daniel replied carefully. "I found a woman and her son after a car accident. Gave them shelter from the storm. Nothing more complicated than basic human decency." Richard stepped forward, his face twisting with impatience. "Cut the act, Carter. We know they're here." Claire's been filling the boy's head with paranoid fantasies about his own family. She's clearly unstable and frankly dangerous to herself and others. The casual dismissal of Claire's sanity made Daniel's hands clench into fists. "From where I'm standing, the lady seems perfectly rational, especially her concerns about certain family members." The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. Edward's polite mask slipped slightly, revealing something predatory underneath. "Mr. Carter, I don't think you understand the situation you've inserted yourself into. My grandson is the heir to a considerable fortune, and there are people who would do him harm to get at that money. His mother, grief-stricken and clearly not thinking rationally, has put him in tremendous danger by running off like this. Seems to me the danger might be coming from closer to home," Daniel said quietly. Edward's eyes went flat and cold. "I beg your pardon." "Well, it's just interesting timing, isn't it? Young man dies in a convenient accident, right before he inherits a fortune, leaving behind a wife and child who suddenly become inconvenient obstacles to other family members' ambitions." The silence that followed Daniel's words was deafening. He could feel the tension radiating from the men in suits, could see Richard's face flushing with barely controlled rage. But Edward himself remained perfectly composed, which somehow then made him infinitely more frightening. "Mr. Carter," Edward said, finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you're making a very serious mistake. I've been patient because I understand you believe you're helping someone in need, but my patience has limits." "So does mine," Daniel replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. And right now I'm thinking 2 scared refugees deserve protection more than some rich folks deserve to get their way. That's when Richard lost control entirely. "You ignorant mountain hick," he snarled, taking several steps toward Daniel. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? We own half the judges in this state. We can destroy your little construction business with a phone call. We can make your life hell in ways you can't even imagine." "Richard," Edward's voice cut through his son's tirade like a blade. "Control yourself." But the damage was done. Richard's outburst had revealed exactly the kind of arrogance and casual cruelty that made his guilt obvious to anyone paying attention. Daniel found himself almost grateful for the man's lack of self-control. "Interesting family dynamic you've got there," Daniel observed. "Real warm and caring." Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to make you an offer. A generous offer considering the circumstances. Return my daughter-in-law and grandson to me, and I'll ensure that your interference in this family matter is forgotten. You'll be compensated for your trouble, of course." "How much?" Daniel asked, curious to see how these people valued human lives. $50,000, cash. The amount was staggering more money than Daniel saw in a good year. But the casual way Edward threw it around only reinforced how little human decency meant to him. "That's a lot of money," Daniel admitted. "But I'm afraid there's a problem with your offer. Which is, the lady and her son aren't mine to sell. They're free people who can make their own choices about where they want to go and who they want to trust." Daniel's voice grew stronger with each word. "And frankly, after meeting you folks, I can understand why they might prefer to take their chances with strangers." Edward's composure finally cracked, his patrician features twisting with fury. "Mr. Carter, you are making the biggest mistake of your life. Do you think your mountain isolation will protect you from my reach? Do you think there's anywhere on Earth I can't find you?" "Maybe not," Daniel admitted. "But right now, the only thing standing between you and them is me, and I'm not moving." The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Daniel could feel sweat trickling down his back, despite the cool mountain air, could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. These men had killed before Michael Marchand was proof of that. They wouldn't hesitate to kill again if it served their purposes. But just as Daniel was beginning to wonder if he'd pushed too far, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the tension. More cars were coming up the mountain road, not the sleek predators favored by the Marchands, but the practical pickups and SUVs driven by working people. The first truck to appear belonged to Tom Murphy, who ran the diner in town. Behind him came Pete Rodriguez from the hardware store, followed by at least 6 other vehicles carrying men Daniel recognized from construction jobs, hunting trips, and Friday night poker games. Within minutes, Daniel's small clearing was crowded with mountain folk, rough, practical people who dropped whatever they were doing to answer some unspoken call for help. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle behind Daniel, not threatening, but undeniably present. "Morning, Danny," Tom called out cheerfully, as if armed standoffs with billionaires were an everyday occurrence. "Heard you might be having some trouble with uninvited guests." Daniel felt a surge of gratitude so powerful, it nearly brought tears to his eyes. These people barely knew Claire and Ethan, but they knew Daniel. And in these mountains, that was enough. "No trouble, Tom. Just some folks who seem to have lost their way." Pete Rodriguez spat a stream of tobacco juice into the gravel, his weathered face expressing exactly what he thought of the expensive suits and city manners. "Awful fancy cars for mountain driving. Easy to get lost up here if you don't know the roads." The message was clear, and Edward Marchand was smart enough to read it. He was outnumbered now, surrounded by people who knew this terrain like the back of their hands, and had no reason to fear his money or influence. "This isn't over," Edward said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Claire is my daughter-in-law, and Ethan is my grandson. They belong with family, not hiding in the mountains with strangers." "Family takes care of each other," Daniel replied. "From what I've seen, these folks are better off with strangers." Edward's smile was sharp as a blade. "We'll see about that, Mr. Carter. We'll see." The Marchands withdrew to their vehicles, but not before Richard shot one last venomous look at the cabin. As the black SUVs disappeared down the mountain road, the assembled mountain folk began to disperse, most of them offering quiet words of support to Daniel before heading back to their own lives. "You need anything, you call," Tom said, gripping Daniel's shoulder. "Anything at all." "Appreciate it, Tom. More than you know." As the last of the trucks pulled away, Daniel found himself alone in the sudden quiet adrenaline still coursing through his veins like fire. The confrontation was over, but Edward Marchand's parting words echoed in his mind with the force of prophecy. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He turned to find Claire standing in the cabin doorway, her face pale but resolute. Behind her, Sophie held Ethan's hand, both children wide-eyed with the realization of what they'd just witnessed. "Are they gone?" Claire asked. "For now." Daniel walked back toward the cabin, noting how Ethan instinctively moved closer to his mother as he approached. "But they'll be back. And next time they'll come prepared for local interference." Claire nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "Then we need to move fast. The safety deposit box we have to try it now before they can set up surveillance on the bank." Daniel looked at this brave woman who'd just watched her worst nightmare materialize in his driveway and felt something shift inside his chest. The attraction he'd been fighting was transforming into something deeper, something that scared him almost as much as Edward Marchand's threats. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this smart. We plan it out, we cover every angle, and we make damn sure we have an exit strategy if things go wrong." Relief flooded Claire's features. "Thank you. God, Daniel, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This could blow up in all our faces." Daniel's voice was grim but determined. "But you're right about one thing: running isn't working. It's time to go on the offensive." As they walked back into the cabin, Daniel caught Sophie watching him with an expression of profound pride. His daughter had just seen him stand up to some of the most powerful people in America, had watched him choose principle over safety. Whatever happened next, at least she would know her father was someone worth believing in. But as Daniel began to plan what might be the most dangerous gamble of his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that Edward Marchand's visit had been about more than just retrieving Claire and Ethan. The old man had been studying the cabin, memorizing faces, cataloging weaknesses. He was planning something. And when it came, Daniel suspected their small mountain community wouldn't be enough to stop it. The only question was whether they could strike first. That evening, as twilight painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Daniel found himself standing at his kitchen table studying a collection of documents that Claire had carefully preserved through weeks of running. Michael Marchand's business cards, copies of teaching certificates, bank statements, and personal letters were spread across the worn wood like pieces of a puzzle that might save their lives. "This is everything I managed to grab before we left," Claire explained, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph showing Michael with his arm around Ethan at what looked like a school science fair. Michael was meticulous about keeping copies of important documents, but he always said the originals were safer in the bank. Sophie sat across from them, having insisted on being part of the planning despite Daniel's initial protests. "If this affects Ethan, it affects all of us," she'd said, with a determination that reminded Daniel painfully of her mother. Now she studied the documents with the same focused attention she brought to her advanced placement classes. "Look at this," Sophie said suddenly, holding up a bank statement from 6 months ago. "There's a notation here about a secondary account, something called MRM Holdings." Claire leaned closer, her breath catching. MRM Michael Richard Marchand. Those are his initials. She looked up at Daniel with growing excitement. "He never mentioned a separate account to me." Daniel examined the statement, noting the modest amounts being transferred monthly from Michael's teaching salary to this secondary account. Looks like he was saving money for something specific. The amounts are small but consistent. Michael always said he wanted to set up a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids, Claire said softly. He used to joke that it would be his way of making the Marchand name stand for something good instead of just profit. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Despite being exhausted by the day's events, he'd refused to go to bed until he knew what the adults were planning. "Are you talking about Dad's secret project?" The three adults turned to look at him in surprise. "Secret project?" Daniel asked gently. Ethan nodded, padding over to lean against his mother's chair. "Dad told me he was working on something special, something that would help other kids go to school like I could. He said it was our family's new legacy." Claire wrapped her arms around her son, tears threatening. "Why didn't you tell me about this before? You were so sad after Dad died. I didn't want to make you sadder by talking about his projects." Ethan's voice was matter of fact, but Daniel could see the weight this boy had been carrying. "Besides, Dad made me promise to only tell you about it when you were ready to hear good things about him again." The simple wisdom of the statement hit Daniel like a physical blow. This child had been protecting his grieving mother while dealing with his own trauma and the terror of being hunted by his own family. The strength it must have taken was almost incomprehensible. "I'm ready now," Claire whispered, pressing her face against Ethan's hair. "I'm ready to hear all the good things about your father." Ethan brightened considerably. He had a whole folder full of papers about the scholarship thing. Articles about kids who couldn't afford college, lists of schools that needed help. Even some letters from kids who thanked him for helping them apply to universities. "Where did he keep this folder?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "In his special safe place," Ethan replied. "The one where he kept all the important stuff he said would help people someday. The safety deposit box." Daniel felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. If Michael had been planning something that would help disadvantaged children, there might be documentation that could establish his character and motivations, evidence that would contradict Richard's narrative about family instability and paranoid delusions. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "did your father ever mention anything about Uncle Richard, about problems in the family business?" The boy's expression darkened. "Dad didn't like Uncle Richard very much. He said Uncle Richard cared more about money than people, and that was a dangerous way to live." "Did he ever say anything specific about Richard's work?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking hard. "Once I heard Dad on the phone with someone talking about numbers that didn't add up. He sounded really upset, kept saying someone was stealing from kids who needed help." Claire's face went white. "Stealing from kids?" "That was the night before Dad went to Uncle Richard's building," Ethan continued. "He was really angry, kept saying he had to stop someone from taking money that was supposed to help people learn." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Michael hadn't just discovered Richard embezzling from family trusts, he'd found evidence that his brother was stealing from charitable foundations, money meant to help the kind of underprivileged students Michael cared so deeply about. Jesus, Daniel breathed. No wonder Richard killed him. Michael wasn't just threatening his inheritance, he was about to expose him as someone who steals from charity. Sophie, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. Dad, what if there's more than just evidence in that safety deposit box? What if Michael was building a case against Richard, like officially? What do you mean? Claire asked. Well, if Mr. Marchand was a teacher, he would have known about proper documentation, right? About how to build evidence for something like reporting a crime. Sophie's young face was animated with possibility. What if he wasn't just collecting proof of the embezzling? What if he was preparing to turn Richard in to the authorities? Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. That would explain the rush to kill him. If Michael was close to filing charges, Richard would have had to act fast, Claire finished, before Michael could expose him. The weight of what they were discussing settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. They weren't just talking about retrieving evidence anymore. They were potentially talking about completing Michael's mission to stop a man who stole from children and murdered his own brother to cover it up. We have to get into that box, Claire said with quiet determination. Not just for us, but for all the kids Richard has been stealing from. For Michael's memory. Daniel studied her face in the warm kitchen light, seeing strength and purpose replacing the fear and desperation that had defined her since that first night. This was a woman who had found her cause, her reason to fight back instead of just running. All right, he said finally, but we're going to need help, and we're going to need to be very, very careful. Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was equal parts desperate and ingenious. Daniel would approach the Bank of the Rockies as Michael's business partner in the Scholarship Foundation, armed with documentation about MRM holdings and a carefully crafted story about needing to access Michael's papers to complete a grant application deadline. The key is confidence, Claire explained as she helped Daniel practice his story. Michael always said that people in positions of authority respond to certainty and legitimate-sounding bureaucracy. If you act like you belong there and know exactly what you're doing, most people won't question you. Sophie, meanwhile, had appointed herself research coordinator, using Daniel's computer to learn everything she could about the Bank of the Rockies, its procedures, and its staff. The branch manager is a woman named Helen Morrison, she reported. She's been there 15 years, has 2 kids in high school, and according to the local newspaper, she's involved in several educational charities. That could work in our favor, Daniel mused. Someone who cares about education might be sympathetic to Michael's scholarship work. Or she might be extra careful about protecting a dead man's private documents, Claire pointed out. We can't assume anything. As they refined their strategy, Daniel found himself increasingly aware of the trust Claire was placing in him. She was asking him to risk everything, his freedom, his reputation, his daughter's security, on a plan that could easily backfire and land him in prison. Yet she seemed completely confident that he would succeed, her faith in him absolute and humbling. What if this doesn't work? He asked, during a quiet moment when Sophie and Ethan were reviewing the documents again. What if I can't get access to the box, or there's nothing useful inside? Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the star-filled mountain sky. Then we'll figure out something else. But Daniel, even if this fails, what you're doing, what you've already done, it matters. You've given us hope when I thought we'd lost everything. She turned to face him, and in the soft light from the kitchen lamp, Daniel could see tears threatening in her green eyes. I haven't just been running from Richard and Edward. I've been running from the feeling that Michael died for nothing, that his murder was going to go unpunished, while his killers inherited billions. You've made me believe that maybe good people can still win sometimes. The raw emotion in her voice made Daniel's chest tighten with feelings he wasn't sure he was ready to acknowledge. "Claire, I know this is crazy," she continued, stepping closer to him. "I know we barely know each other, that everything about this situation is impossible. But these last few days, watching you with Ethan, seeing how kind you are to Sophie, feeling safe for the first time in weeks." She paused, searching for words. "I haven't felt this way since Michael died. Hell, I'm not sure I ever felt this way even with Michael." Daniel found himself reaching for her hands without conscious thought, marveling at how perfectly they fit in his own. "Claire, you've been through hell. You're grateful for safety and kindness, but that doesn't mean don't," she interrupted gently. "Don't tell me what I'm feeling. Don't assume that because I'm vulnerable I can't tell the difference between gratitude and something deeper." She moved closer, still close enough that Daniel could smell the subtle scent of her shampoo, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I know what gratitude feels like. This isn't that." Daniel found himself caught between desire and responsibility, between the overwhelming attraction he felt for this brave, brilliant woman and the knowledge that acting on it could complicate an already impossible situation. The timing is terrible," Claire agreed. "We're in danger, you're risking everything to help us, and we have no idea what tomorrow will bring. But Daniel, what if we don't get a tomorrow? What if Richard finds us, or the bank plan fails, or any of a dozen things go wrong?" She reached up to touch his face with gentle fingers, and Daniel felt his resolve crumbling. "I don't want to waste whatever time we have being careful about feelings that might be inconvenient." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs reminded them they weren't alone. They stepped apart quickly, though not before Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, with a knowing look that suggested she'd witnessed more than they'd intended. "Sorry to interrupt," Sophie said, with the kind of deliberate casualness that only teenagers could manage, "but Ethan's having trouble sleeping. He keeps worrying about tomorrow." Claire immediately shifted into mother mode, her personal feelings taking a back seat to her son's needs. "I'll go talk to him." As Claire disappeared upstairs, Sophie moved to stand beside her father at the kitchen counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with unasked questions and unspoken observations. "She's good for you," Sophie said finally, her voice soft but certain. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Sophie, it's not that simple. Mom would have liked her." Sophie continued, ignoring his protests. "She would have liked how brave Claire is, how much she loves Ethan, and she would have liked seeing you smile again." The mention of Sarah made Daniel's throat tight with emotion. "Your mother wouldn't want me to take advantage of someone who's scared and alone." Sophie turned to face him fully, her blue eyes serious beyond her years. "Dad, I've watched you for 3 years. I've seen you help neighbors fix their roofs after storms, give jobs to guys who couldn't find work anywhere else, volunteer at the food bank every Thanksgiving. You don't take advantage of people. It's not who you are." She paused, studying his face with the intensity she'd inherited from both her parents. "Besides, Claire isn't some helpless victim. She's strong and smart, and she sees something in you worth trusting her life to. Maybe you should trust her judgment about her own feelings." Before Daniel could formulate a response, Claire's voice drifted down from upstairs, soft and melodic, as she sang what sounded like a lullaby to Ethan. The sound filled the cabin with warmth and domestic tranquility, a reminder of what family could sound like when it was built on love instead of obligation. "Just think about it," Sophie said quietly, then headed toward the stairs. "And Dad, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you. Mom would be too." Alone in the kitchen, Daniel found himself replaying the conversation with Claire, the weight of her words, and the memory of her touch, making it impossible to concentrate on anything else. He'd spent 3 years learning to live with loneliness, convincing himself that Sophie was enough, that his memories of Sarah could sustain him indefinitely. But Claire had awakened something in him that he'd thought had died with his wife, the desire to share his life with someone, to build something new and beautiful out of the wreckage of loss. It was terrifying and exhilarating and utterly inconvenient given their circumstances. Yet as Daniel stood in his quiet kitchen, listening to Claire's voice soothe her frightened son, he found himself imagining a future where such moments were commonplace, where this woman and her brave little boy became permanent fixtures in his home, where the laughter and love they'd brought with them never had to leave. It was a dangerous dream, perhaps even a foolish one. But as Daniel finally headed upstairs to try to get some sleep before tomorrow's mission, he allowed himself to hold on to it. Whatever happened at the bank, whatever Richard and Edward Marchand threw at them next, he would fight for the chance to turn that dream into reality. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. Daniel woke before his alarm, his stomach churning with nervous energy and the weight of what lay ahead. Today would either vindicate their faith in Michael's integrity or confirm that they were grasping at straws while killers closed in around them. Claire was already awake when he came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the manila folder containing all their carefully prepared documentation. She looked up as he entered, and Daniel could see the same nervous energy that was eating at him reflected in her green eyes. "Ready for this?" she asked, though her voice carried more hope than confidence. "As ready as anyone can be for walking into a bank and lying through their teeth," Daniel replied, accepting the coffee she'd poured for him. "You sure about the story, all the details?" Michael always said the best lies were mostly truth with just a few crucial changes, Claire said, spreading their forged documents across the table one more time. "You're Daniel Carter Michael's business partner in establishing the Marchand Educational Foundation. You need access to his personal documents to complete a grant application that's due next week." Daniel reviewed the papers. They'd spent half the night preparing letterhead for the fictional foundation correspondence between partners about scholarship recipients, even a fake grant application, with the Bank of the Rockies listed as a reference for the foundation's financial stability. "The MRM Holdings account gives us credibility," Claire continued. "It proves Michael was serious about the scholarship work, that this wasn't just a fantasy. And if Helen Morrison is as involved in educational charities as Sophie found, she should be sympathetic to the cause. And if she's not, if she demands additional verification or wants to call Richard to confirm the story." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then we adapt. We improvise. We do whatever it takes." The determination in her voice reminded Daniel of the steel he'd glimpsed in her from that first night, the strength that had kept her and Ethan alive through weeks of running. This wasn't just about accessing documents anymore. It was about Claire reclaiming her agency, refusing to be a victim any longer. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed and carrying her school backpack. "You're not really going to school today, are you?" Daniel asked. "Of course I am. Someone needs to maintain normal routines so no one gets suspicious about what we're really doing." Sophie's logic was flawless if terrifying. "Besides, Ethan and I worked out a communication system. If anything goes wrong, he can call the school office and they'll get word to me immediately." Daniel felt a surge of pride mixed with terror at his daughter's maturity. Somewhere along the way, Sophie had transformed from the girl who needed protection into a young woman capable of protecting others. "Just be careful. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call Tom Murphy and get somewhere safe." "I will. But Dad..." Sophie stepped forward to hug him tightly. Bring them home safe. All of them. The emphasis on all wasn't lost on Daniel. Sophie had clearly decided that Claire and Ethan were family now, regardless of what the future held. The thought was both warming and terrifying. After Sophie left for school, Daniel spent an hour going over the plan one final time with Claire and Ethan. The boy would stay at the cabin with strict instructions to call Tom Murphy if anyone approached the house. Claire would drive partway down the mountain with Daniel, then wait at a predetermined spot while he attempted to access the safety deposit box. If this goes bad, Daniel told them both, if I don't come back or something goes wrong, you take the truck and you drive straight to the address Sophie wrote down. Tom Murphy will get you somewhere safe until you can figure out your next move. You're coming back, Claire said with fierce certainty. We're all going to get through this. Ethan stepped forward and, to Daniel's surprise, wrapped his small arms around Daniel's waist in a tight hug. Thank you for taking care of us, the boy said quietly. Dad would have liked you. The simple statement nearly broke Daniel's heart. He knelt down to Ethan's level, looking into eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. Your dad sounds like he was a good man, Ethan. The kind of man who would do anything to protect the people he loved. I'm going to try to be that kind of man today. The drive down the mountain was tense and largely silent, both Daniel and Claire lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The drizzle had intensified into a steady rain that drummed against the windshield and turned the winding road treacherous. Several times Daniel found himself thinking about that first night, about the storm that had brought Claire and Ethan into his life. Nervous? Claire asked, as they neared the point where she would get out to wait. Terrified, Daniel admitted, but also angry. The more I think about what Richard did, murdering his own brother, stealing from charities, threatening a child, the more I want to see him burn for it. Claire reached over to squeeze his hand. That's good. Anger can give you strength when fear tries to paralyze you. Just don't let it make you reckless. They reached the designated waiting spot, a small roadside diner that was busy enough to provide cover, but isolated enough to avoid unwanted attention. As Claire prepared to get out of the truck, she turned to face Daniel one final time. Whatever happens in there, whatever you find or don't find, know that you've already given us more than I ever dared hope for. She leaned over to kiss his cheek, her lips soft and warm against his skin. Come back to us, Daniel. We'll be waiting. The 20-minute drive to Cedar Falls gave Daniel time to get into character, to become the kind of confident businessman who would have partnered with Michael Marchand on educational philanthropy. By the time he pulled into the Bank of the Rockies parking lot, his nervous energy had transformed into focused determination. The bank was exactly what he'd expected from Sophie's research, a solid conservative institution that valued stability and community connections over flashy modernization. Helen Morrison's office was on the second floor, overlooking the main banking floor, through windows that suggested transparency and accessibility. Mr. Carter, Helen Morrison, was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her handshake was firm, her manner professional but warm. I understand you need access to Michael Marchand's safety deposit box. That's right, Daniel replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. Michael and I were partners in establishing the Marchand Educational Foundation. We have a crucial grant application due next week, and I need to access some documentation he kept in his personal box. He handed over the carefully prepared folder, watching Helen's face as she reviewed the documents. Her expression was neutral, professional, but Daniel thought he detected a flicker of interest when she reached the correspondence about scholarship recipients. This is impressive work, Helen said after several minutes of reading. Educational access is something our bank takes very seriously. We've sponsored several scholarship programs ourselves over the years. Michael was passionate about giving kids opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. Daniel replied, allowing genuine emotion to color his voice. His death was a tremendous loss to the educational community. Helen nodded sympathetically. I remember reading about the accident. Such a tragedy. He was so young. Which is why it's crucial that we complete his work. The foundation was his dream, and these scholarships could change dozens of lives. Daniel leaned forward slightly, letting urgency creep into his voice. But without access to his research and documentation, we'll miss the grant deadline and lose funding for the entire program. Helen studied the documents again, and Daniel held his breath as he watched her internal debate play out across her features. Bank procedures versus helping deserving students, exactly the kind of conflict Claire had predicted. Mr. Carter, I appreciate what you're trying to do, and the Foundation's work sounds truly worthwhile, Helen said finally. But I have to follow proper procedures regarding safety deposit boxes. Normally, I would need court authorization or documentation shut from the estate executor to grant access. Daniel's heart sank, but Helen wasn't finished. However, she continued, if you were simply retrieving documents that belonged to the Foundation, rather than Mr. Marchand personally, that might fall under a different set of guidelines. She was giving him an out, Daniel realized. A way to justify bending the rules for a good cause. The scholarship, research, and grant documentation absolutely belongs to the Foundation, Daniel said carefully. Michael may have stored it in his personal box for security reasons, but it was always intended for our shared work. Helen nodded slowly. In that case, I think we can arrange a supervised access. You'll need to sign an affidavit stating that you're only removing Foundation documents, and I'll need to be present to witness what you take. Of course. That's perfectly reasonable. 20 minutes later, Daniel found himself in the bank's vault, standing before a small metal box that might hold the key to everything. Helen Morrison stood beside him, clipboard in hand, as he inserted the key and opened the lid. The box was meticulously organized exactly as Claire had predicted. File folders labeled with Michael's precise handwriting contained birth certificates, insurance policies, property deeds, and other personal documents. But at the back of the box, Daniel found what he was looking for, a thick manila folder labeled MEF Research. Marchand Educational Foundation. Daniel explained to Helen as he carefully removed the folder. This should be everything we need. Inside the folder, Daniel's hands began to tremble as he realized the scope of what Michael had compiled. Financial records showing systematic embezzlement from multiple charitable trusts. Correspondence with accountants questioning unusual transactions. Bank statements revealing money being funneled through shell companies controlled by Richard Marchand. But most damning of all was a letter addressed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, dated the day before Michael's death. In it, Michael laid out a detailed case against his brother, including specific evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of charitable funds, totaling nearly $50 million. My God, Daniel breathed, forgetting for a moment that Helen was watching. Is everything all right? Helen asked, concern evident in her voice. Yes, just... Michael was even more thorough than I realized. This research is going to help a lot of kids. Daniel carefully placed all the documents back in the folder, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd found. Michael hadn't just discovered Richard's crimes, he'd built an airtight case against him. And Richard had killed him to prevent that case from reaching the FBI. But now, thanks to Michael's meticulous documentation and foresight, they had everything they needed to destroy Richard Marchand and clear Claire and Ethan's names. As Daniel signed the necessary paperwork, and prepared to leave the bank. Helen Morrison offered one final kindness. "Mr. Carter, I hope you'll keep our bank in mind when the foundation is fully established. We'd be honored to support Michael's legacy in any way we can." "I think Michael would have liked that very much," Daniel replied, meaning every word. The drive back to meet Claire seemed to take forever, but Daniel's hands were steady on the wheel despite the explosive evidence sitting on the passenger seat. They had done it. Against all odds, they had retrieved the proof they needed to expose Richard's crimes and ensure justice for Michael's murder. Claire was waiting at the diner, her face tense with worry, until she saw Daniel's expression. Then relief flooded her features, followed quickly by desperate hope. "You found something," she said, as she climbed into the truck. "We found everything," Daniel replied, handing her the folder. "Claire, your husband was a hero, and now we're going to make sure the world knows it." As they drove back up the mountain toward home, toward Ethan and Sophie, and the family they were building together, Daniel tilted something he hadn't experienced in years: absolute certainty that they were going to win. Richard Marchand had made one crucial mistake when he killed Michael. He'd assumed that murder would silence his brother forever. But the dead Daniel had learned sometimes speak loudest of all. The folder sat open on Daniel's kitchen table like Pandora's box. Its contents spread across the worn wood in careful rows that told the story of systematic corruption and calculated murder. Claire's hands trembled as she lifted each document, her eyes growing wider with every page that revealed the scope of her husband's investigation and the depth of Richard's betrayal. $50 million, she whispered, staring at a bank statement that showed funds meant for inner-city schools being diverted to Richard's personal accounts. He stole $50 million from children who needed it most. Ethan stood beside his mother's chair, reading over her shoulder with the same intense focus he'd inherited from his father. For a 9-year-old, his comprehension of the financial documents was remarkable, but then again, Daniel reflected this boy had been forced to understand adult concepts far too early. "Mom, look at this," Ethan said quietly, pointing to a letter addressed to the headmaster of his former school. Dad was trying to give them money for new computers, but Uncle Richard took it instead. The pain in Claire's voice was raw as she read Michael's words aloud. "Dear Dr. Henderson, I've discovered irregularities in our foundation's disbursements that I'm working to resolve. Please know that the promised technology grant will be honored in full once I've corrected certain administrative errors." She looked up at Daniel with tears threatening. He was trying to fix Richard's thefts while protecting the reputation of the family name. Daniel picked up another document, a meticulously detailed timeline showing how Richard had been skimming money from charitable trusts for over 3 years. Each theft was small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough that the cumulative effect was devastating to the organizations that depended on Marchand family funding. "Your husband was building a federal case," Daniel said, his voice heavy with admiration and sorrow. "Look at this. He has bank records, email correspondence, even photographs of documents from Richard's office. This isn't just evidence of embezzlement. This proves premeditation conspiracy fraud on a massive scale." Sophie returned from school to find the 3 of them hunched over the documents like archaeologists examining ancient treasures. Her backpack hit the floor with a thud as she took in the scene, immediately understanding that something momentous had occurred. "You got into the safety deposit box," she said, her voice mixing excitement with awe. "We got everything," Claire replied, gesturing to the spread of papers. "Your dad was incredible today, Sophie. He walked into that bank and convinced them to let him access documents that could bring down one of the most powerful families in America." Sophie beamed with pride, moving to stand behind Daniel's chair. "So what happens now? Do we call the FBI, the police?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, because everyone in the room understood that having evidence and being able to use it safely were two very different things. Daniel picked up Michael's unsent letter to the FBI, dated just hours before his murder, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "The problem is trust," Daniel said carefully. "Edward Marchand wasn't lying when he said his family has connections everywhere. Judges, politicians, law enforcement, we don't know who might be in their pocket." Claire nodded grimly. Michael was paranoid about that in his final weeks. He kept saying he needed to find someone in law enforcement who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Someone with enough integrity and independence to take on the Marchand family. "What about that friend of yours in Colorado?" Sophie suggested. "The federal prosecutor you were trying to reach?" "Sarah Chen," Claire said thoughtfully. "She's clean as far as I know, but she's also 3 states away and getting these documents to her safely." She trailed off, the implications clear to everyone. Ethan had been quietly studying one particular document while the adults talked. Now he looked up with the serious expression that made him seem far older than his years. "What about the newspapers? Dad always said journalists were like watchdogs for democracy." "Smart thinking," Daniel agreed. "But again, we'd need to find someone who can't be threatened or bought off. Someone with enough credibility to make the story stick." As they discussed their options, Daniel found himself studying Claire's face in the warm kitchen light. The fear and desperation that had defined her since that first night were being replaced by something harder and more determined. This was a woman who had found her purpose, who was ready to fight back against the people who had destroyed her family. "There's something else we need to consider," Claire said suddenly, her voice taking on a new gravity. "Once we release this information, there's no going back. Richard and Edward will know we have everything, and they'll stop at nothing to silence us permanently." The words sent a chill through the room. They'd been living with danger for days, but using Michael's evidence would escalate that danger exponentially. The Marchands would no longer be trying to quietly retrieve inconvenient family members. They'd be fighting for their freedom, their fortune, and their legacy. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Daniel said slowly. "Right now, they have all the advantages. They know where we are, they have unlimited resources, and they can take their time planning their next move. But if we go public with this evidence suddenly, they're the ones who are vulnerable." Sophie, who had been examining the financial documents with teenage intensity, suddenly looked up with excitement. "Dad, what about Marcus Webb?" Daniel felt his eyebrows rise. Marcus Webb was an investigative journalist for the Denver Post, who had built his career on exposing corruption in high places. He'd won a Pulitzer Prize 3 years earlier for a series on political corruption that had sent 2 state senators to prison. "Webb's good," Daniel admitted. "Tough, honest, can't be intimidated. But he's also in Denver and getting to him safely." "He's not in Denver," Sophie interrupted. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. There was an announcement in the school newsletter last week. He's coming to speak at the Regional Journalism Conference at the university in Cedar Falls, tomorrow night." The room went completely silent as the implications sank in. Marcus Webb, one of the most respected investigative journalists in the region, would be less than 40 miles away in less than 24 hours. "It's perfect," Claire breathed. "We could get the documents to him directly, make sure they reach someone who can't be silenced or bought off." Daniel felt a familiar mixture of hope and terror. "It's also incredibly dangerous. The journalism conference will be public, well attended. If the Marchands are watching, then we'll have to be smarter than them," Claire said with fierce determination. "Michael spent months building this case. We can't let his murder go unpunished just because we're afraid of the risk." Ethan had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone whose life depended on understanding every nuance. Now he spoke up with a question that cut straight to the heart of their dilemma. If we give the papers to this journalist, man, will Uncle Richard go to jail? The innocent directness of the question made Claire's breath catch. She knelt down beside her son's chair, taking his small hands in hers. Yes, sweetheart. If we do this right, Uncle Richard will go to jail for what he did to your father. Good, Ethan said with satisfaction. Dad always said bad people should face consequences for their actions. The simple moral clarity of childhood made Daniel's chest tighten with emotion. This boy had lost his father to greed, and violence had been forced to run for his life while carrying secrets that could topple empires. Yet his primary concern was still justice, seeing that his father's killer faced appropriate punishment. All right, Daniel said, making the decision that would change all their lives. We contact Marcus Webb, but we do it smart, careful with backup plans and exit strategies. Over the next several hours, they crafted a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. Sophie would attend the journalism conference as a student interested in investigative reporting. Her age and apparent innocence would make her invisible to any Marchand surveillance. She would approach Webb during the reception following his speech and arrange a private meeting where Daniel could present Michael's evidence. I don't like putting Sophie at risk, Daniel said as they finalized the details. Dad, I'm not at risk, Sophie protested. I'm just a high school student asking questions about journalism. No one will think twice about it. Claire reached across the table to squeeze Daniel's hand. She's right. Sophie's our best chance of making contact without raising suspicions. As evening settled over the mountains, they spent time preparing for what might be their final night of relative safety. Once they made contact with Marcus Webb, there would be no turning back. The Marchands would know their secrets were compromised, and the gloves would come off entirely. Daniel found Claire standing on the back porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. She was watching Ethan and Sophie play a card game at the picnic table, their laughter carrying on the cool mountain air like music. Second thoughts? Daniel asked, settling beside her on the porch swing Sarah had loved so much. About exposing Richard Never. Claire's voice was firm, but Daniel could hear the underlying uncertainty. About putting your family in danger every minute. Daniel studied her profile in the fading light, noting the way her blonde hair caught the last rays of sunshine, the strength in her jaw that spoke of determination forged by necessity. Claire, what we're doing tomorrow, it's not just about justice for Michael anymore. It's about stopping Richard from stealing from more charities, from hurting more families. I know, but knowing something is right doesn't make it less terrifying. She turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the complex mix of hope and fear that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Daniel, if something goes wrong tomorrow, if the Marchands find us or the plan fails, nothing's going to go wrong, Daniel said firmly, though he knew he couldn't guarantee such a thing. But if it does, Claire continued, her voice soft but insistent. I need you to know something. These days with you and Sophie, they've been the best days Ethan and I have had since Michael died. Not just because we've been safe, but because we've felt like we belonged somewhere again. She paused, searching for words to express feelings that defied easy description. I know this situation is impossible, that everything about us being here is based on tragedy and danger. But what I feel for you, it's not just gratitude or the comfort of protection. It's something real, something I never expected to find again. Daniel felt his heart hammering against his ribs as she spoke her words, giving voice to emotions he'd been fighting since that first night. Claire, let me finish, she said gently. If we don't make it through tomorrow, if Richard wins, and we don't get our chance to build something real together, I wanted you to know that loving you, because that's what this is, Daniel. I'm falling in love with you. Loving you has made me believe in hope again. The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Daniel found himself caught between the desire to sweep her into his arms and the knowledge that tomorrow might tear them apart forever. I love you too, he said simply, the words feeling both natural and revolutionary. I've been trying not to, telling myself it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous. But watching you fight for your son, seeing your strength and courage, how could I not love you? Claire's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. So, what do we do with that? With loving each other in the middle of all this chaos? We hold on to it, Daniel replied, reaching up to touch her face with gentle fingers. We let it make us stronger, braver, and we fight like hell to make sure we get our chance to see where it leads. Claire leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as if memorizing the moment. When this is over, when Richard is in jail and we're safe, will you still want this? Will you still want us? Claire, I want forever with you, Daniel said with absolute certainty. I want to wake up every morning knowing you and Ethan are part of my family. I want to watch Sophie teach him how to drive, want to help you build that scholarship foundation Michael dreamed about. I want all of it. Before Claire could respond, Ethan's voice called out from the picnic table. Mom, Sophie taught me a new card game, come play with us. They joined the children for what might be their last peaceful evening together, playing simple games and sharing stories that wove their separate histories into something that felt like family. Daniel found himself memorizing every detail, the way Ethan's face lit up when he won a hand, the sound of Sophie's laughter mixing with Claire's, the feeling of contentment that settled over him like a warm blanket. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Daniel and Claire sat by the fireplace planning the final details of their approach to Marcus Webb. They reviewed every possible contingency, every potential failure point, until they were both confident they'd covered every angle. You know, Claire said as they prepared to turn in for the night, regardless of what happens tomorrow, you've already won. How do you figure that? You gave us hope when we had none. You showed Ethan what a good man looks like, showed me what it feels like to be protected instead of hunted. Even if Richard stops us tomorrow, he can't take that away. Daniel pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at how perfectly she fit against his chest. He's not going to stop us. We have right on our side and your husband's evidence and more determination than Richard ever counted on. They kissed, then soft and gentle at first, then with increasing passion, as months of grief and weeks of fear gave way to the overwhelming need to affirm life and love in the face of danger. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together in the firelight. Tomorrow, Claire whispered, and Daniel wasn't sure if it was a promise or a prayer. Tomorrow. He agreed, sealing the word with another kiss that tasted of hope and possibility. The next day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that seemed to promise new beginnings. Daniel woke early to find Claire already in the kitchen making breakfast with the focused intensity of someone channeling nervous energy into productive activity. Sleep at all? He asked, accepting the coffee she pressed into his hands. A little. You. Some. Daniel settled at the table, studying her face in the morning light. She looked determined, almost serene, like someone who had made peace with whatever fate awaited them. Ready for this? More than ready. Michael waited too long for justice. Today he finally gets it. Sophie and Ethan joined them for breakfast, both children understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. The conversation was lighter than Daniel had expected, filled with Sophie's excitement about attending a real journalism conference and Ethan's questions about whether the journalist would ask him about his father. "Mr. Webb might want to interview you eventually," Claire explained gently. "But not today. Today is just about getting him the documents safely." As they prepared to leave for Cedar Falls, Daniel found himself taking one last look around the cabin that had sheltered them through their darkest hours. Whatever happened today, they wouldn't be coming back as the same people who had huddled here in fear and uncertainty. Today, they would either win their freedom or lose everything trying. The drive to the university was tense but hopeful, with Sophie chattering about her cover story while Ethan dozed against his mother's shoulder. Daniel found himself thinking about Michael Marchand, about the courage it must have taken to investigate his own brother's crimes, knowing the potential consequences. "He'd be proud of what we're doing," Claire said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "He'd be proud of what you're doing," Daniel corrected, taking his evidence and making sure it reaches the right people, finishing what he started. The University of Colorado's Cedar Falls campus was bustling with activity when they arrived, students and faculty moving between buildings with the purposeful energy of academic life. The journalism conference was being held in the main auditorium, with smaller breakout sessions scattered across the campus. They found a parking spot with a clear view of the auditorium entrance and settled in to wait. Sophie would attend the afternoon sessions and evening reception, making contact with Marcus Webb during the social hour following his keynote speech. "Remember," Daniel said, as Sophie prepared to leave the truck, "you're just a student interested in investigative journalism. Ask intelligent questions, seem eager but not desperate. Make him remember you so that when we approach him later, he'll be more receptive." "I've got this, Dad," Sophie assured him, her confidence genuine but tinged with nervousness. "Mr. Webb won't know what hit him." As they watched Sophie disappear into the crowd of conference attendees, Daniel felt Claire's hand slip into his. Her fingers were cold despite the warm afternoon, betraying the anxiety she was working so hard to hide. "She'll be fine," Daniel said as much to convince himself as Claire. Sophie's smart, personable, completely natural in situations like this. "I know. It's not Sophie I'm worried about." Claire's voice was tight with concern. "Daniel, what if Richard anticipated this? What if he's been watching the conference waiting for us to make exactly this kind of move?" The possibility had occurred to Daniel as well, but dwelling on it would only paralyze them. "Then we deal with whatever comes. But Claire, we can't let fear of what might happen stop us from doing what we know is right." They spent the afternoon in the truck, taking turns walking around the campus to avoid attracting attention while keeping the auditorium entrance in sight. Ethan read quietly in the back seat, occasionally looking up to ask questions about what they were waiting for or what would happen next. As evening approached and the reception began, Daniel felt his nerves stretching taut with anticipation. Everything they'd worked for, everything Michael had died trying to accomplish, would be decided in the next few hours. Sophie's voice crackled through the cheap walkie-talkie they'd bought that morning. "I'm in position. Mr. Webb just finished his speech. It was amazing, by the way. He talked about the responsibility journalists have to speak truth to power even when it's dangerous." "Perfect timing," Claire murmured, her grip on Daniel's hand tightening. "I'm going to approach him now," Sophie continued. "Wish me luck." The next 30 minutes felt like 30 hours as they waited for word from Sophie. Daniel found himself watching every person who entered or left the auditorium, looking for signs of Marchand's surveillance or anything else that might indicate their plan had been compromised. Finally, Sophie's voice came through the radio again, crackling with excitement. Contact made. He's very interested and wants to meet with you tonight. Private conference room in the library, 9 p.m. He'll be alone. Daniel felt a surge of relief so powerful it left him lightheaded. Outstanding work, Sophie. Get out of there now and meet us at the rendezvous point. As they drove to the predetermined meeting spot, a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, Daniel found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A storm, a car accident, a decision to help strangers in need, and now they were about to bring down one of the most powerful families in America. Nervous? Claire asked as they waited for Sophie to join them. Terrified, Daniel admitted, but also excited. Your husband's work is finally going to see the light of day. Sophie arrived 20 minutes later, practically vibrating with excitement and adrenaline. Dad, Mr. Webb is exactly what you'd expect from someone who takes on corrupt politicians for a living. Tough, smart, completely fearless. When I mentioned the Marchand family, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. What did you tell him exactly? Claire asked. Just that my friend had evidence of financial crimes involving the Marchands, and that lives were in danger because of what the evidence revealed. I told him it was the kind of story that could win prizes and save lives. Sophie grinned. I think I sold it pretty well. As 9 o'clock approached, Daniel felt the familiar mixture of hope and terror that had become his constant companion. They were so close to victory, so close to justice for Michael, and safety for Claire and Ethan. But they were also walking into a situation where one wrong move could destroy everything. Whatever happens in there, Daniel told Claire as they prepared to enter the library, know that I'm proud of you, proud of your courage, your determination to see this through. Whatever happens, Claire replied, we're in this together now, all of us. Marcus Webb was waiting for them, Tim. In a small conference room tucked away in the basement of the library, his laptop open and recording equipment discreetly arranged on the table. He was exactly what Daniel had expected. Mid-50s, graying hair, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their appearance and demeanor. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Marchand. Webb stood to shake their hands, his grip firm and confident. Sophie told me you have information about the Marchand family that I might find interesting. Given recent events, I'm very eager to hear what you have to say. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Recent events. Webb's smile was grim. Richard Marchand was found dead in his office this morning. Apparent suicide according to the initial police reports. Left behind a note confessing to embezzling from family charitable trusts. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Webb's words sank in. Richard was dead. The man who had murdered Michael, who had threatened Claire and Ethan, who had stolen millions from children who needed help, he was gone. Suicide. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. That's the official story, Webb replied carefully. But given the timing and certain other factors, there are those of us who suspect Richard's death might have been more expedient than voluntary. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as the implications became clear. Edward Marchand had eliminated his son to prevent the family secrets from being exposed. Richard's death wasn't justice, it was just another murder in service of protecting the Marchand Empire. Mr. Webb, Daniel said carefully, we have evidence that suggests Richard's crimes were far more extensive than any suicide note would indicate. Evidence that might explain why someone wanted him silenced permanently. Webb leaned forward, his journalist instincts fully engaged. I'm listening. Daniel opened the folder containing Michael's meticulously documented case against his brother, spreading the documents across the conference table like cards in a deadly game of poker. As Webb examined each piece of evidence, his expression grew increasingly grave. "My God," Webb breathed after reviewing the FBI letter Michael had never lived to send. "This isn't just embezzlement. This is systematic fraud, conspiracy, possibly even murder." "Michael was killed the day before he planned to take this evidence to the authorities," Claire said quietly. "And now Richard's dead too, supposedly by his own hand. How convenient for the remaining family members." Webb was already taking notes, his mind clearly racing with the implications of what they'd shown him. "Mrs. Marchand, are you willing to go on record with this, to tell your story publicly and provide testimony about your husband's investigation?" "Yes," Claire said without hesitation. "Michael died trying to expose the truth. I won't let his murder be covered up by another convenient suicide." Over the next 2 hours, Webb conducted the most thorough interview Daniel had ever witnessed. He asked probing questions about Michael's investigation, about the threats against Claire and Ethan, about their weeks of running and hiding. He reviewed every document with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years exposing corruption in high places. "This is Pulitzer Prize material," Webb said, finally, his voice heavy with the weight of what they'd shared. "But more than that, it's a story that could save lives and ensure justice. Are you prepared for what comes next? Once this story breaks, you'll be in the spotlight permanently. There will be no more hiding, no more running." Claire looked at Daniel, then at Ethan, who had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted by the day's tension. "We're ready. We've been running long enough." "Then let's make sure the world knows who Michael Marchand really was," Webb said, extending his hand to seal the agreement. "And let's make sure his killers face justice, no matter how powerful they think they are." As they left the library and walked out into the cool night air, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope for the future. The evidence was in the hands of someone who could use it, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Tomorrow, the world would learn the truth about the Marchand family. And tomorrow, Claire and Ethan could finally stop running and start building the life they deserved. But tonight, as they drove back up into the mountains toward home, they were just a family who had chosen to fight for justice and won the first battle in what would surely be a long war. "It's really over, isn't it?" Claire asked as the lights of Cedar Falls faded behind them. "The running is over," Daniel confirmed. "But everything else, building a life together, seeing justice done, creating something beautiful out of all this chaos, that's just beginning." The next morning brought news that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their victory. Daniel woke to his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, Marcus Webb's name flashing on the screen, with an urgency that made his stomach clench with dread. "Daniel, we have a problem." Webb's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Edward Marchand's people got to my editor before I could file the story. They're claiming the documents are forgeries, that Claire is mentally unstable, that this whole thing is an elaborate fraud designed to extort money from a grieving family." Daniel felt the world shift beneath his feet as he processed the implications. "What does that mean for the story?" "It means my paper won't touch it without independent verification of the documents." "They're scared, Daniel. The Marchands have too much influence, too many connections. My editor basically told me that unless I can produce Michael Marchand himself to authenticate the evidence, the story dies here." Claire appeared in the doorway, immediately reading the alarm on Daniel's face. She moved quickly to his side, pressing close so she could hear Webb's voice through the phone. "There has to be something we can do," she said, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who'd tasted victory only to have it snatched away. "Michael died building that case. We can't let them cover it up again." Webb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new determination. "Actually, there might be a way. But it's dangerous, and it requires Claire to do something that could put her and Ethan at tremendous risk. What kind of risk? Daniel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Edward Marchand is holding a press conference this afternoon. He's going to announce the establishment of a memorial scholarship fund in Michael's name, positioning himself as the grieving patriarch, honoring his beloved son's memory. Its brilliant public relations transforms him from potential suspect into sympathetic victim. Claire's face went white with fury. He's using Michael's death to make himself look good while covering up his own grandson's murder. Exactly. But here's the thing, the press conference is being held at the Marchand estate, and it's open to media and community members. If Claire were to show up publicly, confront Edward with the evidence in front of cameras, it would be a media circus. Daniel finished understanding immediately where Webb was heading. Impossible to suppress or spin. The story would be out there regardless of what my paper decided to do. Other outlets would pick it up, social media would explode, the FBI would have to investigate. Webb paused. But Claire, you'd be walking into the lion's den. Edward will have security lawyers, probably half the local political establishment on his side. Claire was already shaking her head before Webb finished speaking. I don't care. If that's what it takes to expose the truth about Michael's murder, then that's what I'll do. Claire, no, Daniel said immediately. It's too dangerous. Edward's already killed 2 people to protect his secrets. Walking into his territory surrounded by his people is exactly what Michael would have done, Claire replied with fierce conviction. He never backed down from doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. I won't dishonor his memory by hiding now. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Webb arranged for friendly media contacts to be present at the press conference, journalists who would ask the right questions and broadcast whatever confrontation occurred. Sophie and Ethan would stay at the cabin with Tom Murphy and several other mountain folk standing guard. No one was taking any chances with their safety. I should be going with you, Daniel said for the 10th time, as Claire prepared for what might be the most dangerous few hours of her life. No, you should be staying here to protect our children, Claire replied, and the way she said, our children, made Daniel's heart skip a beat. Sophie and Ethan need to know that no matter what happens to me, they'll be safe. She was right, and Daniel knew it. But that didn't make watching her prepare to face down Edward Marchand any easier. The woman who had stumbled out of a wrecked car just weeks ago had transformed into someone formidable, someone who radiated strength and purpose. Promise me something, Daniel said, as they stood together on the front porch, watching Webb's car wind its way up the mountain road. Promise me you'll be careful. That you'll remember Ethan needs his mother more than the world needs another martyr. Claire reached up to touch his face with gentle fingers, her green eyes soft with love and determination. I promise I'll come back to you, all of you, but I also promise I won't let Michael's killers escape justice. The kiss they shared felt like a benediction, and a farewell tender and desperate and full of all the words they hadn't had time to say. When Webb's car pulled into the driveway, Claire straightened her shoulders and walked toward her destiny with the calm grace of someone who had made peace with whatever consequences awaited. Daniel stood on the porch long after the car disappeared down the mountain, his hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to follow them. Sophie appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his, with the quiet comfort she'd perfected over the years since her mother's death. She's going to be okay, Dad. Claire's stronger than Edward thinks she is. I know, Daniel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. But strength doesn't stop bullets. The Marchand estate was exactly what Daniel had expected: old money grandeur, designed to intimidate and impress. Rolling lawns, ancient oak trees, a mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from European aristocracy. Cars lined the circular driveway as Colorado's elite gathered to hear Edward Marchand's tribute to his beloved son. Claire sat in Webb's car at the edge of the property, watching through the trees as reporters set up cameras and local dignitaries filed into the mansion's grand foyer. Her hands were steady as she reviewed the key documents one final time, but her heart hammered against her ribs with the kind of terror that comes from stepping deliberately into mortal danger. "You don't have to do this," Webb said quietly. "We can still find another way." "No, we can't. And you know it." Claire's voice was calm, resolved. "This is the only chance we'll get to tell the truth while the whole world is watching." The press conference was being held in the mansion's main hall, a cavernous room decorated with oil paintings of stern-faced Marchand ancestors and enough flowers to stock a funeral home. Edward stood at a podium flanked by enormous photographs of Michael, looking every inch the grieving patriarch in his perfectly tailored black suit. "My son Michael was taken from us far too soon." Edward began, his cultured voice carrying just the right note of controlled sorrow. "But his legacy of caring for underprivileged children will live on through the scholarship fund we're establishing in his memory." Claire entered through the side door just as Edward was describing Michael's passion for education. And the irony of hearing Michael's killer praise his victim's virtues nearly overwhelmed her with rage. She moved quietly along the wall, Webb beside her with his recording equipment ready, until she was positioned where the cameras couldn't miss her. "The Michael Marchand Memorial Scholarship will ensure that deserving students have access to the educational opportunities my son believed every child deserved." Edward continued, warming to his theme. "It's what Michael would have wanted, a way to transform tragedy into hope." "You're absolutely right, Edward," Claire said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "Michael would have wanted his legacy to help children, which is why he spent the last months of his life investigating how his own brother's stealing from those same children." The effect of her words was electric. Every head in the room turned toward Claire as shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. Edward's carefully composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Claire, my dear." Edward recovered quickly, his voice dripping with false concern. "I'm so glad you're here. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my daughter-in-law, who has been struggling with grief-induced delusions since Michael's tragic death." Delusions. Claire stepped forward, holding up the folder containing Michael's evidence. "Is that what you call bank records showing Richard stole $50 million from children's charities? Delusions." The room erupted in chaos as reporters surged forward, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward Claire. Edward's security team moved to intercept her, but Webb stepped into their path, his press credentials and camera crew forcing them to hesitate. "Mrs. Marchand, what evidence do you have of these allegations?" a reporter called out. Claire opened the folder with steady hands, pulling out bank statements and financial records that told the story of systematic theft and corruption. "I have documents showing that Richard Marchand embezzled money meant for underprivileged children. I have correspondence proving that Michael discovered the theft and was preparing to expose it to federal authorities. These are forgeries." Edward's composure finally cracked completely, his patrician mask falling away to reveal raw fury. "This woman is mentally unstable, clearly incapable of caring for her son. She's been manipulated by people seeking to exploit our family's grief for their own gain." "Then you won't mind having the documents authenticated by independent experts," Webb interjected smoothly, his camera capturing every nuance of Edward's growing desperation. "You won't mind having federal investigators examine your family's charitable foundations to verify their accuracy." Edward's face went through a series of expressions, rage, calculation, and finally a kind of cold resolve that made Claire's blood turn to ice. This was a man who had ordered the deaths of his own sons to protect his empire, and she had just backed him into a corner in front of the entire world. "Security," Edward said quietly, and Claire saw armed men beginning to move through the crowd toward her position. But the journalists weren't intimidated by Marchand's security, and the presence of cameras made violence problematic. Claire found herself surrounded by a protective wall of reporters and cameramen, all of them shouting questions about the documents she held and the allegations she'd made. "Mrs. Marchand, are you claiming that your brother-in-law murdered your husband? Mr. Marchand, how do you respond to allegations that your family has been stealing from children's charities? Mrs. Marchand, do you fear for your safety after making these accusations?" Claire seized the moment, speaking directly into the cameras, with the clear, strong voice of someone who had found her purpose. "My husband Michael discovered that his brother Richard was embezzling millions of dollars from charitable trusts meant to help underprivileged children access education. When Michael tried to expose these crimes, he was murdered, killed in an explosion that was made to look like an accident." The room had gone completely silent except for the whir of cameras and the scratch of pens on paper. Claire continued, her voice never wavering despite the mortal danger she knew she was in. "Richard is now conveniently dead, supposedly by suicide, but I believe he was killed to prevent him from implicating other family members in these crimes. The evidence Michael gathered proves systematic fraud, conspiracy, and murder, all to protect a criminal empire built on stolen money meant for children who needed help." Edward stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Enough of this circus. Claire, you're clearly having another breakdown. I think it's time you returned to the psychiatric facility where you can get the help you so desperately need." The threat was clear to everyone in the room. Edward was setting up a scenario where Claire would disappear into a private mental health facility, never to be seen again. But before his security team could move, the sound of sirens filled the air outside the mansion. FBI agents poured through the doors of the Great Hall, their presence transforming the press conference into something that looked more like a raid. The lead agent, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, approached the podium with the kind of authority that made even Edward Marchand step back. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We're here to execute search warrants for the Marchand estate and all associated business premises." Claire felt her knees go weak with relief as she recognized the name. Sarah Chen, her college friend, the federal prosecutor she'd been trying to reach when the car accident changed everything. Somehow Webb had managed to contact her and convince her to act on Michael's evidence. "Agent Chen," Edward said, his voice strained, but still carrying traces of his usual arrogance. "I assume this has something to do with my disturbed daughter-in-law's fantasies. I assure you we're prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation. Mr. Marchand, based on evidence provided by Mrs. Marchand and authenticated by our forensic accountants. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder," Agent Chen replied calmly. "You have the right to remain silent." As Edward was led away in handcuffs, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him, Claire found herself surrounded by reporters desperate for follow-up interviews. But all she could think about was getting back to Daniel and the children returning to the mountain cabin that had become their sanctuary. Webb appeared at her elbow, grinning like someone who'd just won the lottery. "Mrs. Marchand, I think we can safely say the truth is out there now. Edward won't be able to spin his way out of federal charges, not with this much evidence and this much publicity." The drive back to the mountains felt like ascending from hell into heaven. With every mile that passed, Claire felt the weight of weeks of terror and uncertainty lifting from her shoulders. They had done it. Michael's evidence was in the hands of people who could use it. His killers were facing justice, and she and Ethan were finally truly safe. Daniel was waiting on the front porch when Webb's car pulled into the driveway, and the relief on his face when he saw Claire step out unharmed was worth every moment of danger she'd endured. She ran to him, then throwing herself into his arms, with the desperate joy of someone who had never expected to feel safe again. "It's over," she whispered against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and mountain air that had become home to her. "It's really over." "I saw it on the news," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion as he held her tight. "You were incredible, Claire. Brave and strong and absolutely incredible." Sophie and Ethan emerged from the cabin, both of them having watched the press conference coverage with Tom Murphy and the other mountain folk who'd stood guard. Ethan launched himself at his mother with a force that nearly knocked her over his small arms, wrapping around her waist with desperate relief. "Mom, you did it. You got Uncle Richard and Grandpa Edward arrested. Everyone on TV is saying Dad was a hero." Claire knelt down to hold her son properly, tears streaming down her face as she realized that for the first time since Michael's death, Ethan could talk about his father without fear or secrecy. "Yes, sweetheart. Everyone knows now that your father was trying to help children, and that he died because he was brave enough to do what was right." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and the slow process of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by violence and fear. Edward Marchand was denied bail and faced federal charges that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. The various Marchand charitable foundations were placed under federal oversight, while investigators worked to restore stolen funds to their intended recipients. Claire found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as the widow who brought down a billionaire crime family, but she handled the attention with the same grace and determination she'd shown throughout their ordeal. More importantly, she and Ethan were finally free to live openly without fear of being hunted by their own family. 3 months after the press conference, Daniel stood in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a cradle he'd been secretly building. The smooth cherry wood gleamed in the afternoon light, every joint perfect, every curve designed with love and hope for the future. "It's beautiful," Claire said from the doorway, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly that had become apparent only in the last few weeks. "Our daughter is going to love it." Daniel looked up at the woman who had transformed his life in ways he'd never imagined possible, marveling at how perfectly she fit into his world, and how completely she'd healed the wounds left by Sarah's death. "You sure it's a girl?" "I'm sure." Claire smiled, moving to run her fingers along the cradle's smooth rails. "Sophie and Ethan have already picked out names. They're very excited about being big siblings." The sound of laughter drifted through the workshop window from the backyard, where Sophie was teaching Ethan how to properly swing an axe while splitting kindling for the winter. Their voices mixed with the distant sound of construction equipment. Daniel's crew was building the new Marchand Educational Foundation, headquarters on a piece of land Claire had purchased just down the mountain from the cabin. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, pulling Claire into his arms and marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "About giving up billions of dollars to live in a mountain cabin with a construction worker and his daughter?" Claire pretended to consider the question seriously. Not even for a second. They had married quietly 2 months earlier, a simple ceremony in the meadow behind the cabin, with only Sophie, Ethan, Tom Murphy, and a few other mountain folk as witnesses. Claire had kept her maiden name for legal reasons. She was now the sole administrator of Michael's estate, and the various charitable foundations being rebuilt from the wreckage of Marchand corruption. "The foundation is going to help so many kids," Claire said, settling into Daniel's embrace as they watched their children play in the golden afternoon light. Michael's dream of using marchand money to actually help people instead of just accumulating more wealth, it's finally becoming reality. Daniel thought about the scholarship recipients who would benefit from Michael's legacy, about the schools that would receive funding stolen by Richard and now restored by federal investigators. Michael Marchand's death had ultimately accomplished exactly what he'd hoped. It had transformed the Marchand name from a symbol of greed into a force for good in the world. "He'd be proud of what you've built," Daniel said, pressing a kiss to the top of Claire's head. "And proud of the man Ethan's becoming." Through the window they could see Ethan carefully positioning a piece of wood while Sophie guided his axe stroke. The boy who had once stood terrified in a mountain storm was growing into someone confident and capable, someone who understood that real strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. "Dad's teaching me about building things," Ethan had told Claire just the week before, and the casual way he'd referred to Daniel as Dad had brought tears to both their eyes. "He says everything important starts with a good foundation." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the four of them gathered on the front porch for their evening ritual of watching the day fade into peaceful twilight. It was a simple pleasure sitting together in comfortable silence while the mountain settled into night around them. "You know what I love most about this place?" Claire said, her head resting on Daniel's shoulder, while Sophie and Ethan competed to see who could spot the first star. "What's that?" "The quiet. For months I lived with this constant noise in my head, fear, anger, desperation, the sound of engines that might be following us. But here in this place you built with your own hands, surrounded by people who care about each other instead of money. Here I can finally hear myself think." Daniel understood exactly what she meant. The cabin had been his refuge after Sarah's death, the place where he'd learned to live with loss and build something meaningful from the wreckage of his old life. Now it was becoming something even more precious, the foundation for a new family built on love and trust rather than obligation and tradition. "There's something else," Claire continued, her voice soft with wonder. "Something I never expected to find again after Michael died." "What's that?" "Hope," she said simply. "Hope for tomorrow, for our children's future, for the possibility that good people can still win sometimes." Sophie had spotted the first star and was making an elaborate wish while Ethan waited impatiently for his turn. Their laughter filled the evening air with music that Daniel knew he would never tire of hearing. "What are you wishing for?" Claire called out to the children. "Can't tell or it won't come true," Sophie replied, but her eyes were sparkling with mischief. "But let's just say it involves a certain baby sister learning to love these mountains as much as we do." Ethan made his wish with the serious concentration he brought to everything important, then looked up at the stars with satisfaction. "I wished for Dad's workshop to always smell like sawdust and coffee," he announced, "and for Mom to never stop singing lullabies." "Good wishes," Daniel said solemnly, understanding that this boy had learned to treasure the small, everyday moments that made a house into a home. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Claire paused on the threshold to look back at the starlit meadow where she and Daniel had been married, where their children played and laughed and grew stronger every day. Michael used to say that some people were born to accumulate wealth, others to accumulate wisdom, and the lucky few to accumulate love, she said quietly. "I think we might be the lucky ones." Daniel followed her gaze across the peaceful landscape that had witnessed so much drama and change, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. A storm, a car accident, a choice to help strangers in need, such small things to build a lifetime of happiness on. But as he turned off the porch light and followed his family inside, Daniel reflected that perhaps the most important things in life always began with the smallest acts of courage. The courage to stop for someone in need, to offer shelter from the storm, to stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful they might be. 6 months later, as he held his newborn daughter in the same hospital where Sophie had been born, Daniel marveled at how completely his life had been transformed. The tiny girl in his arms, Sarah Claire Carter, named for both the woman who had first taught him to love and the woman who had taught him to love again, represented the perfect fusion of past and future loss and recovery, sorrow and joy. "She's perfect," Claire whispered from the hospital bed, her face glowing with exhaustion and happiness. "Look at those fingers. She's going to be a builder like her daddy." Sophie and Ethan pressed close to admire their new sister, both of them enchanted by the tiny human who had finally completed their unconventional family. Through the hospital window, Daniel could see the mountains that had sheltered them all through their darkest hours, standing eternal and protective against the evening sky. "What do you think, kids?" Daniel asked softly. "Ready to take her home?" "She belongs with us," Ethan said with absolute certainty. "In the cabin with the mountains where families take care of each other." And as Daniel looked around at the faces of the people he loved most in the world, his wife, his children, the family they had built from wreckage and hope, he knew that Ethan was absolutely right. They belonged together in the place where love had taken root and flourished despite every attempt to destroy it. The Martian Empire had fallen, its corruption exposed, and its stolen wealth returned to those who needed it most. Edward would spend his remaining years in federal prison, and Richard's crimes had been revealed to the world. But more importantly, Michael's dream of transforming his family's legacy had finally come true. The Marchand name would be remembered not for greed and violence, but for the children it helped and the futures it made possible. Years later, when journalists asked Claire about the most important lesson she'd learned from her ordeal, she always gave the same answer. "Sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Sometimes home isn't a place but a feeling. And sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary courage." Daniel never tired of hearing her say those words because he knew they were true. He'd seen that courage in Claire as she faced down killers to protect her son. He'd seen it in Sophie as she risked her own safety to help strangers become family. He'd seen it in Ethan as he learned to trust again after betrayal had nearly destroyed his faith in human goodness. And sometimes late at night, when the mountain wind whispered through the trees and his family slept safely around him, Daniel saw that same courage in himself. The courage to open his heart again after loss, to build something beautiful from broken pieces, to believe that love was always stronger than fear. The cabin still stood in its meadow, weathered but solid, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the transformative magic of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things. And in the workshop behind the house where Daniel continued to build furniture and dreams, with equal skill, the scent of sawdust and coffee lingered always a reminder that home is not a place you find, but a place you build one loving act at a time.